Lord Blackwood and the Bigfoot by Smapty. July 3rd, 1857. It has been the better part of a year since I set sail from England. I feel myself overcome with a certain melancholy every time I watch the white cliffs of Dover disappear over the horizon, seemingly watching me as I venture out into the wilderness. But whatever guilt I might feel, there is much work to be done. The vast, untamed wilds of the world wait for no man, and it is our duty as Englishmen to carry the light of civilization to the corners of creation. Today, I have alighted in the Oregon Territory, in a newly founded town on the shores of Puget Sound that the pioneers call Seattle. Even now, in the height of summer, it is a cold and dreary place. Clouds meander across the heavens, bringing showers and fog, as cool winds blow across the water. And on all sides, the tiny town is surrounded by the massive evergreens that populate this country. In many ways, it is not unlike the climate of my boyhood home in the West Country, and I felt an odd sense of nostalgia as the summer rains wet my cheek. But it is not the town, nor the weather that interests me. It is the forests that hold my true reason for venturing to this virgin frontier. In the town I have hired porters and 2 guides, a white man and a civilized Indian. I spent many hours in conversation with the noble native, which confirmed the legends I had heard repeated third hand in the Gentleman's Club back on Broad Street. In the unexplored woods east of the Sound, so the Indians said, there lived a race of primates unknown to science, half again as tall as a man, covered head to toe in thick fur, quick and nimble, and possessing of an almost man-like cleverness. Sasquatch, my guide called the creatures, but they had been called by many names by the tribes he knew of: Semeque, Momo, Quilki, Skookum, and Bigfoot among them. Even among the Indians, they were mostly regarded as little more than legend, but my guide informed me that he had seen one in the flesh 2 years prior, in the foothills of the mountain his people call Tahoma, and that he had heard tales of a tribe that worshipped them as gods. Tomorrow, we set out for Tahoma, for it is Bigfoot that I seek now as my quarry. I mean to find one of the elusive beasts and bring it back to England, dead if I must, alive if I can. I have brought ample equipment from England and purchased fresh victuals from the shops of this town. Tonight I plan, and I pray that my hunt will not fail. July 7th, 1857. The forests of the territory make for slow going. In my adventures I have hacked through jungle reeds, forced my way through the tall grasses of the Serengeti, braved the unforgiving cold of the Himalayas, and baked under the cruel Egyptian sun. But what hand or blade can cast aside the trunks of the ancient evergreens that stand by the myriads in every direction? The guides assure me we are making steady progress, though it seems we have gone scarcely 24 miles since we left Seattle. I caught my first glimpse of Tahoma today as we entered a clearing upon a hill, and I was overwhelmed by the beauty of the tableau that I observed. Tahoma is not nearly the height of the famous Peak 15 that Sir War described last year in Nepal. But unlike the great Himalayas, it stands alone. A solitary peak, towering above the forests of the territory, like a proud and mighty king, surveying a kingdom encompassing all that it perceives. Shortly after midday, we chanced upon a fox cub, scarcely old enough to hunt for itself, imprisoned in a cage of wood and hides. My Indian guide pointed out a clever set of machinations connected to the box, and informed me it was a trap laid by the Indians who lived in those woods, and that the unfortunate rascal had been lured in by a scrap of meat to be captured. He said to me that his people were most efficient. The beast's hide would make clothing, its teeth jewelry, its meat food for the children, its sinew cords and rope. Let there be no doubt, any who may chance to read this, that I with glee engaged in many a fox hunt in the county pastures in my younger days. But to ride out with one's hounds is a gentleman's game. In this, my friend, there was no sport. I looked into the creature's eyes, and it seemed to regard me almost as a starving beggar child might regard a man of wealth, envious and jealous, but at the same time supplicant, as if to beg me for mercy. I drew my knife and cut the cords holding the cage door shut, and the vulpine burst free and darted into the woods, fetching a brief glance at me as it ran away. July 8th, 1857. This morning we encountered a half-dozen Indians in a hunting party near the banks of a river. I had thought at first to call it the Blackwood River when we forded it, though my guide informed me it was known to his people as Nisqually. The Indians regarded us at first with suspicion. I know not if they had seen a white man before, and I feared the worst. But my Indian called out to them in a language strange to me, and they responded gleefully in the same. I learned that he was of the same tribe as they, and that he called their leader his cousin, and they received us warmly. We luncheoned on salmon the Indians had caught in the river and traded with them for food and supplies. I was most excited to hear from one of the younger natives that he had seen a Bigfoot once when he was young, for the porters believed this expedition to be a fool's errand, and with this revelation, they seemed most renewed in their vigors. By the time we parted ways, I had managed to learn a few words of their language. After I have brought a Bigfoot back to England, I shall have to return to this land and learn more of the ways of these people. July 13th, 1857. I must write in haste, for my captors have not discovered this book. I am in darkness alone, my feet bound, in a tent in a place I do not know, well guarded without by my captors. They came upon us 2 nights ago. We had encamped for the night in a clearing not a dozen miles from the place my Indian told me he had seen the Bigfoot 2 years hence. They must have been lurking in the darkness for hours and came upon the chief porter unawares while he stood the night watch. Before I could reach my rifle, all but one of the porters and my Indian guide had been felled by the brute's arrows and hatchets. I took 2 of the bastards in reply with my rifle, and 4 more with my pistol, before one of them grabbed me from behind and knocked me out. When I awoke, I had been tied to a pole, and 2 of the natives were carrying me deeper into the woods. I could see my Indian, and the last surviving porter, being carried similarly. I called out to my Indian, and he told me that he recognized our captors as a tribe that had been ancient enemies of his own. They were unrepentant pagans and cannibals, he told me, and worshipped a strange god that lived in the mountain. It was said they raided the villages of the other tribes for sacrifices to offer to their god. Surely, he said, we had been chosen to fulfill this onerous duty. It is very cold here. Though the sun shines brightly through the trees at midday, I know not whether the natives have my weapons or not. I pray that they do, for if I cannot reach them, I will surely perish in this wilderness. July 16th, 1857. Words cannot express the terror I have beheld this day. The natives have brought us to their home camp, in the foothills. Even now, in the midst of summer, clumps of snow congregate under the rocks and at the bases of the trees. At midday, the 3 of us were escorted to a snowy clearing by the edge of a vast wood climbing up the mountain. Hundreds of natives formed a half-circle around the clearing, and our porter was loosed from his bonds and dragged to the center. One of the natives began beating upon a massive drum and singing in a bizarre language, the likes of which I have never heard. Others joined in, and the forests were filled with the din of 1,000 screaming natives. Suddenly, the trees at the edge of the clearing seemed to rustle and part way, and the throng silenced as it emerged. Bigfoot, in the flesh. The tales had not done the beast justice. It stood 15 feet if it stood an inch, and it could not have weighed less than half a long ton. I could scarcely discern its countenance beneath the matted fur that covered its face. Ravenous, primal, caked in blood and spittle. It bore the scars of many struggles, and, praying that the reader will forgive my lack of modesty, displayed its manhood proudly. It set its eyes on the porter and charged at him with a speed I would not have expected from a brute of its size. The porter made to run, but the natives closed in upon him and allowed him no egress. Within seconds, the beast was upon him. I could hardly bear to look as it ripped him limb from limb, its yellowed, sharpened teeth tearing into his flesh, his blood running down its jaws as it greedily feasted upon him. They returned me to the tent afterward. I fear I am next. July 19th, 1857. I hope by now, should anyone be reading this year's hence, that you regard me as an honest man. Throughout my many years exploring the unknown corners of the world, I have considered it my obligation to tell no less than the whole truth regarding my discoveries, that my fellow countrymen might know of the world that lies beyond the borders of our great empire, and prepare for the day when the light of goodliness and peace shines around the world. I say this now, for the events I must now recount might seem a fantasy to you, dear reader. Indeed, I would find it difficult to believe myself, had I not seen it with my own eyes. But on my sacred honor as an Englishman, I assure you that every word of it is true. On the afternoon of the 17th, the natives offered my Indian guide as a sacrifice to Bigfoot, as they had my porter. Yesterday, the 18th, they prepared to do the same to me. I spent the morning in solemn prayer and reflection, and for the first time in my life, I understood the sorrow of a condemned man awaiting the hangman's noose. I felt I had lived a good life, and I was prepared to do what any good Englishman would, and meet my Maker with a stiff upper lip and a clean conscience. The Indians lead me to the clearing and loose my bonds. I strode calmly into the center of the clearing and closed my eyes. If I was to die, I intended to die with my dignity intact. The drumming and the screaming started, and I heard the trees rustle as Bigfoot drew near to claim his meal. But it was not Bigfoot's approach that silenced the natives. Rather, I heard, distant yet remarkably near, the howl of a fox. Muffled chatter arose from the throng as a second howl answered the first. Soon a third animal was howling, and before long the woods were alive with a cacophony. Not only foxes, but I heard the howls of wolves, the screeching of hawks and falcons, the roar of the mountain cats, even the calls of pigeons. I opened my eyes as 100 animals or more emerged from the woods and set upon the Indians. I beheld foxes and wolves, elk and deer, gulls and eagles, bears and raccoons, side by side like a cavalry charge, as they knocked the wild men to the ground and tore out their throats. Every one of the creatures ran right past me, barely darting their eyes my way as I beheld the sight. Some even seemed to have markings on their brows, like the war paint the Indians themselves were decorated with. I chose to take advantage of the opportunity and ran. Neither man nor beast made any attempt to stop me as I made for the west, away from Tahoma and Bigfoot, towards the sea and hopefully some sign of civilization. By nightfall, I had easily put 10 miles between myself and the camp, but alone, hungry, bruised and exhausted, and in the dark, I could go no further, and curled up by a tree to sleep. When I awoke this morning, I found myself surrounded by wild beasts. Half a dozen deer stood in a semicircle before me, paint on their faces, their horns and coats covered with blood, and 2 raccoons in their center. I panicked when first I saw them, and instinctively tried to reach for my gun, for fear that they had come to finish me off. They stepped back in unison when they saw me startle, and I saw that one of the deer, upon its back, was carrying a large bundle, my own possessions, scavenged from the remains of my camp. The creature knelt to the ground and shrugged, letting it fall to the ground, and I eagerly examined it. Much of what I had brought into the woods was gone, but my rifle was intact, and my pistol, and a tent, and alcohol with which to clean my cuts and scrapes, and enough dried rations to last 2 weeks' time. I barely had time to ponder this miracle before the rest of the animals fell to their knees as well, and opened a path between them. A fox approached me, old, weathered, bearing signs of having seen more winters than most of its kind do. It bore an air of dignity about it that one rarely sees from such creatures as it approached me and stood before me. It seemed to examine me carefully, contemplating as it looked me over, before it uttered a low bark and one of the raccoons approached me. I noticed now something I had overlooked before. The raccoon had, tied to its back with a thin piece of twine, a rolled piece of paper. The fox gestured at the paper with its nose, and I reached down and drew the paper free. I unrolled it and found a handwritten message in English, which I present to you below. We, Alaric V, by the grace of God, King of all the forest, Lord of the plains, Duke of the grand fir and the undergrowth, Count of the swamp, Margrave of the nameless mountain, Warden of all the streams and rivers, and Lord Protector of the tribes of man, Defender of the faith, recognizing you as a fellow Christian and a civilized man, grateful for your rescue of our royal issue from the devious machinations of the pagan natives, thankful that your kind have returned to this land, hopeful that you will on our behalf deliver news to your homeland that Christendom shall have in these parts a steadfast ally, acknowledging that in rescuing you from the false god of the pagans, we are responsible for your welfare and safe passage in our lands. Do hereby, on this day, the 19th day of the 7th month, in the year of our Lord, 1857, bestow upon you the rank of Knight Commander of the Order of the Thistle, with all the privileges and responsibilities of that office. Command you to, from this day forward, act as a loyal servant of Christ and his Church, Catholic and Apostolic, for as long as you shall live, and charge you to return to the lands of Christendom, bearing news of our kingdom, and to return with an embassy for the negotiation of amicable communion between our nations. To this document, we affix our seal, sacred and royal. The paper had been signed, so to say, with an ink stamp of what I assumed to have been the fox's paw print. I looked down at the creature, who I now saw regarded me with a gaze almost human in its wisdom. It raised its right paw to touch its forehead and lowered it to its chest and shoulders, making the sign of the cross. I repeated the gesture, and it nodded to me. Having apparently reached an agreement, the fox that called itself Alaric V turned and strode away into the woods, its motley retinue following behind. September 7th, 1857. It has been over a month since I made my escape from the forest and entered my convalescence here in Seattle. I wandered 5 days in the woods and might be wandering still. If not for that, by chance I found the same friendly tribe of Indians I had met on the banks of the Nisqually 2 weeks before. With what bits of their language I knew, I tried to tell them of our encounter with the natives, the Bigfoot, and the strange group of animals that had been my salvation. I know not if they understood me, or if they merely thought me mad, but a small group of them traveled north with me and lead me back to town, where I have rested and healed my wounds since. It is too late in the year to attempt another expedition in search of the Bigfoot. I am told that the winter in these parts is long and cold, and that it will be April before another expedition to the foothills is advisable. In any event, I have little money left with which to hire anyone. I have sent a letter south to San Francisco to be telegraphed to the Royal Society in London, containing an account of my findings and a request for financing to launch a proper expedition into this wilderness, whether to capture a Bigfoot or to establish an embassy with the strange nation of the Fox King Alaric. Barring disaster, I expect a reply by Christmas. I do not hold much hope that they will assent to such a proposition. After all, I am the only witness to these fantastical events, and the only evidence, the declaration of knighthood granted me by the Fox, will not be in London for several years or more. Perhaps I shall leave this territory entirely when the next ship arrives in May, and set out for other parts unknown. I heard before I left London that the White Raja in Borneo has acquired a strange machine that fell from the sky. Who knows what other wonders might lurk in the Javanese jungles, waiting to be shown the light of day by one such as myself. Lord Blackwood presents a true account of the events of 1666. Grandfather was the third son of his father, Philip Blackwood. He was never expected to inherit the family estate and received little of the formal education and upbringing afforded to his brothers, Stephen and Clifford. Were it not for their untimely deaths, the details of which I dare not go into here for the sake of their reputations, the obligation would never have befallen him. At the age of 12, his father purchased for him a naval commission, but he fared poorly as a midshipman, lacking the necessary discipline for so formal a setting, and at the age of 15, enlisted aboard a privateering vessel that took up arms against the Spanish off the coast of the Americas for well over a decade prior to his accession. I was not yet a boy of 10 when he passed into the hands of his maker, and he was at the time of very advanced age, even by the standards of my family's well-known longevity. But even as a centenarian, he still possessed most of the traits of his privateering youth. He stood easily over 7 feet tall, with a grey beard, which I am told, unlike my own brown moustache, was red as blood in his early years, which stretched the length of his chest, and a long head of hair to match, with steely blue eyes that seemed to pierce one's soul, and a booming voice that cut to the bone. He was known throughout his life for his extreme devotion to the Christian faith, though he subscribed to no particular confession, Catholic or Protestant, as he found them all lacking. He wore about his neck a crucifix of the finest silver on a chain, which he would frequently brandish as a ward against evil forces, and was wont to carry no fewer than 7 Bibles of various translations on his person at all times, including a hand-illuminated copy in Enochian said to have been penned by John Dee himself. He was rarely seen without a brace of pistols worn over each shoulder, a sword on one hip, and several phials of holy water in a satchel worn upon the other. He would eagerly thrash any man who profaned the holy name in his presence. But he was no teetotaling Puritan either. He could easily best any man in a drinking contest, was a notorious womanizer, and in matters of the flesh, he could utter oaths that would make the most libidinous of seamen blush. Even after ascending to the peerage, it seemed impossible to tame him. He was possessed with a perpetual wanderlust that drove him to constant adventuring, a trait I would seem to have inherited from him, though I have fortunately been spared of many of his other persuasions. He was, at various points in his life, a cavalier, a witch-finder, a freelance exorcist, a plague doctor, a pirate, a condottiere, an ambassador, and for a period of 6 months, the Doge of Venice. But during the years in question, he was occupied in the profession that earned him the greatest amount of notoriety, that of an elf hunter. Elves are real, my friends. The beings, also known among our people as fairies, are thought of in this day and age as lithe, miniature, whimsical figures, such as the winged creatures seen in the artificed photographs that have beguiled Conan Doyle, or the creatures of folk tales that mend shoes or bake bread while a hapless working man is fast asleep, or the labourers who assist Father Christmas, who, I may assure you, plays a fine game of cribbage and can imbibe whiskey in quantities that would kill most men, with his annual deliveries. In previous centuries, however, they were no such laughing matters. The word fairy, as any academic can tell you, is derived from the fair folk, a euphemism spoken so as to avoid speaking their true name, which I will not publish here, because to merely speak that name aloud was to risk acquiring their attention, and to be noticed by the fair folk, depending on their temperament, may be worse than a capital sentence. It was thus prudent, if one must speak of them at all, to do so flatteringly, so that if you caught their attention, they would at least take little offense. It is now believed that the elves are wholly extinct as a race. No reliable account of a living specimen has been given since the beginning of the previous century, and even by that time they were rare, having mostly been hunted down during the late Middle Ages. If Darwin's theories on the origin of species are to be accepted as fact, which I do, to the eternal consternation of my brother the Archbishop, they comprised Homo alvis, a close cousin of our own race, divorced from mankind some hundreds of thousands of years ago. Physically, they resembled ourselves, but what differentiated them from us was a power of the mind. They could, with a thought, alter the world around them to their liking. They could change their own appearance or that of others, cause crops to grow instantly or to improbable sizes, manipulate the minds of men and beasts into doing their bidding, invade the dreams of sleepers and cause them malady or ecstasy, and in many sundry other ways bend the fabric of nature to their bidding. Because of this ability, they never built settlements or labored as our ancestors did, nor did they ever become great in number. They often lived alone or in small groups, in areas unpopulated by man, abandoned by them or on their outskirts, and lived mercurial lives, wishing their desires into existence as they needed, toying with men as they desired, and coupling only when they chose to, as they rarely died of age or accident due to their abilities, and had no need of children to labor for them or inherit what they left behind. But I digress. When the plague first struck London in the summer of 1665, it was believed to be that same common malady the Black Death that has beleaguered Europe for centuries and had recently affected other towns in the southeast of England. Indeed, the symptoms of the disease in the early weeks and months were identical to that infamous ague: fever and the formation of pustulent sacs in the groin and extremities, followed by seizures, gangrene, suffocation, and death. Quarantines were enacted in and around the city, and a great many doctors and searchers were employed by the city to find the sick, document their passing, and collect the bodies for burial in mass graves. It was quickly noted, however, that the illness seemed to disobey many of the laws of nature that were at the time understood in regards to disease. Many of those who fell ill had had no contact with other afflicted persons, nor been exposed to miasmas or filth. And indeed, a good many people so stricken had been perfectly healthy one day before dying abruptly the next. As summer gave way to winter, a new condition was noted among the sick. Many began to suffer from abrupt consumption before or during the onset of the other signs of the plague, turning pale and anemic, seemingly overnight. On the 5th day of January, the sun set at 10 minutes after 2 o'clock, a peculiarly early hour even for London, inexplicable by astronomers even today, and seemingly unobserved elsewhere in the country. It was a long, chilly, and dark night. Though there was no sign of cloud, Pepys wrote in his diary that neither the moon nor the stars could be seen in the sky, and while the temperature was said to be well below freezing, the dew refused to form frost, instead clinging to every surface, impossibly cold and penetrating to the bone. The following morning, the sun did not break the horizon until 15 minutes after 9, and when the pale winter morning was finally illuminated, the people beheld an unfathomable horror in the Thames. About 50 of men and women floating dead in the river, face down, stripped to the buff, all of them pale as ivory, their trunks cut open and stitched together again as if by a skilled dissector. In the days that followed, the families and neighbors of those poor souls would be identified and all told a similar tale. The individual had spontaneously fallen ill during the long night, grown pale, and become absolutely mad, and in their madness attempted to attack and kill them. In a handful of cases, they were successful, strangling the life out of their loved ones, seemingly with no recognition of what they were doing, or biting and tearing at their flesh until they expired from loss of blood. Though in the majority of instances, their relations were successful in restraining them, or were forced to kill them outright in self-defense. In all situations, the afflicted person eventually expired on their own terms, and each family told the same story of what occurred afterward. A man in the costume of a plague doctor came knocking at their door, entreating them to bring out their dead, upon which they delivered them into a wheelbarrow he hauled behind him, stacked with other bodies in a similar state. This alone was cause of alarm, both to the Lord Mayor and to the Privy Council, as such savagery had never been encountered before in England. But stranger still was the events of the following days, when many of those dead spontaneously arose, most of them in a partial or extreme state of decomposition, lacking both breath and heartbeat, and yet somehow ambulatory, and again attacked anyone who happened to be in their presence. No such resurrection of the dead had been recounted since the time of Christ, and the circumstances of that miracle were quite unlike the horror that had been unleashed upon London. The Church was hesitant to address the nature of the event, but the fifth monarchists proclaimed it a sure sign that the millennium was imminent, and a good many of their membership began to withdraw from civilization, isolating themselves in the country to prepare for the divine scourging they expected to occur. And though the fifth monarchists have passed into the annals of history, the fifth church, those doomsayers cleave to, is believed to persevere in the shadows of polite society to this day. It was the unanimous agreement of the city fathers that an expert in matters preternatural was needed, and it was thus that the Lord Mayor sent notice to the Basque country, where grandfather had of late been at work exterminating a coven of druids who threatened to unleash a terrible doom upon the Spanish crown, that his services were required with the utmost urgency. Upon his arrival in the city several weeks later, grandfather recounts in his papers that the situation in London had become unimaginably dire. Day and night no longer seemed to follow any consistent pattern. The sun would set at a moment's notice and rise again at midnight, or not rise again for several days. Likewise, there were times when the sun failed to set, and the city baked under its unceasing warmth. When night fell, the risen dead roamed the streets with seeming impunity, attacking any they encountered, and the recently deceased were seen to dig themselves out of the mass graves dug for the victims of the pestilence. It was rumored that they even teemed through the empty halls of the Tower of London and of St. James. Few ships ventured to the city, for the malady that befell it had become well known. But ships departed constantly, their captains knowing full well they might arrive at some foreign shore, only to be ordered to return, lest they spread the same doom into those lands. The strange plague doctor reported on the night of the 5th had not appeared again, but other strange occurrences were observed nonetheless. On his second day in the city, grandfather recounts that he saw 24 deer marching down Marylebone in a tight formation, as if pulling a coach, but they had no riders or harnesses, save for one at the rear of the troop that carried a dead fox upon its back. As he observed silently, the formation approached one of the mass graves, and the fox was shunted off of the heart and into the pit, and the venison retired to the woods as formally as they had arrived. In his notes from the first few days, and his discussions with the doctors of the city, he discovered that although the quarantine had proven ineffective, and disease and death were rampant within the walls and without, that few of the sick and dead bore the distinctive buboes that marked the beginning of the plague. Grandfather surmised that although the Black Death had indeed been the origin of the city's misfortune, it had already passed its course. What affected it now was not of nature's doing. The dead who walked the streets had shown themselves, under his examinations, to be utterly feral. No spark of the soul that had once slept within that flesh yet remained, only the desire to kill and to eat. They seemed to suffer no pain, and feared not the crucifix he wore around his neck, but recoiled from its touch, which left a mark as though it were a branding iron. Fire was effective at returning them to their rest, as was dismemberment and, to his uneasy discovery, a silver bullet to the head or heart. This was all the proof Lord David Blackwood needed to ascertain the cause of London's ongoing terror. A fairy, or fairies, were surely afoot. The revenants themselves were not fey, nor were they the strigoi that haunt the Balkans, but there could be no other explanation for their animation than the mad desires of one of those terrific sylvan elders. To protect the citizenry from the dead, grandfather recruited as many of the militia as were still healthy into his service, and every able-bodied silversmith in London was commissioned to supply them. He armed them with silver bullets for their guns and silver-tipped swords. and silver crucifixes such as the one he wore. For it is well known that a crucifix of silver, blessed in the name of God, will warn against the presence of fairies by glowing brilliant blue. When night fell, they patrolled the streets to dispatch any of the wandering dead they encountered and to watch for any sign that their creator was near. The mass graves he ordered burned, and when it was observed that the sky was beginning to dim, the churches of the metropolis rang their bells in the greatest cacophony London has ever heard in peacetime, warning the townsfolk to return to their homes, shut themselves inside, and emerge not until dawn broke. The searchers of the dead were ceaselessly at their work, for even a single undiscovered body left to rise could cause untold devastation. Pamphlets were circulated broadly, and ministers preached from street corners, warning of the danger of the night and calling on one and all to watch for any of the signs that might indicate their neighbor was a fairy in disguise. Their tendency to shift subtly in appearance when glimpsed only in the corner of one's eye, a smell of fresh flowers when none are present, their fear of the cross and silver and the sound of church bells, a whispered laugh when one thinks oneself alone. As the months passed, and winter bled into a summer, as inconsistent and grim as the winter had been, dozens if not hundreds of Londoners had been arrested on suspicion of being fey, but none had shown themselves to be the genuine article until a certain evening late in August, as grandfather was purging a ward in Southwark, well past midnight, when a messenger found him, reporting a strange discovery in Pudding Lane. A deputy had been patrolling the area, presently free of the dead, when he observed a glimmer of light emerging from the boarded-over window of a shuttered bakery. Bidding his fellows to remain silent and ready their weapons, he approached the bakery and, peeping through the crack, beheld a sight that gave him reason to think he had become mad. The oven was alight, dough was being mixed and kneaded, pies were being stuffed, bread was baking, and meat was roasting on a spit above a flame, yet no man's hand tended any of it, save for a young man who could scarcely be older than 20, who stood leaning against a wall, motionless, watching. The deputies broke down the door of the bakery and quickly apprehended the man, who gave no struggle. But no sooner did they lay his hands on him than the wizardry around them ceased. The dough fell idle, the spit ceased to turn, the oven extinguished itself. He spoke only Dutch, and proved unable to answer their inquiries, so they delivered him to the Old Bailey, where grandfather met him after dawn had broken. No sooner did he enter the chamber, where the youth had been clapped in irons, than did he notice the aura emanating from his crucifix. Grandfather had encountered fairies before, and it had shone almost brighter than the sun in their presence. This was no such emanation, but a dull glow, as if a distant memory of the setting sun. Grandfather spoke little Dutch himself, but he found himself able to converse with the youth enough to discern that his name was Wouter van der Horn, and he had recently arrived from the Spanish Netherlands. He refused to say much more, until grandfather threatened to remand him to the church, to discern what truths they could persuade him to part with, at which point he gave an explanation of his behavior at the bakery that shook grandfather to his core. He insisted that he was not a fairy, but that his own grandfather was, and he had come to London to help him, for he was gravely ill. After certain negotiations were made and warnings issued, Wouter agreed to take grandfather and his deputies to meet the elder Van der Horn, and as another premature night fell, the pair made their way through the streets of London with an escort of deputies, as well as the Bishop of London and several of his deacons, who had asserted a pressing theological interest in resolving these calamities. Wouter guided them to a crypt in a forgotten cemetery outside the walls, where he said the old man had taken refuge, and escorted them down a staircase into a chamber where there lay, on a threadbare bed, a man both impossibly old and impossibly disfigured. He was shriveled and wrinkled to what must have been half his size in his youth, bereft of any hair, his eyes clouded and obviously blind or near blind. He breathed each breath with great difficulty, and issued forth a great and raspy wheeze as he did so. Moreover, he was covered head to toe, almost completely in buboes, and when his plague-addled frame met the light of the party's torches, many of the men recoiled in horror lest they be infected. Grandfather's crucifix glowed brighter than before, but still not as much as he had seen in the past. Before Grandfather could speak, the bishop demanded of the old man that he explain himself, and like his grandson, he spoke only Dutch, obligating Grandfather to translate. The elder, who called himself Johann, said he was some 517 years of age and had lived for most of his life in the Low Countries. His mother was a fairy who lived alone in the woods and, unlike many of her kind, desired to bear and raise children more than anything her psychical abilities could provide her. Finding no suitable mates among her own kind, as, according to the papers I have alluded to, they were almost entirely extinct in Europe by that point, she beguiled a woodsman into marrying her, and in the fullness of time, he became their only issue. As a child, he lived in the woods with his mother, but he never learned to master the manipulation of the world in the way of her kind, and his abilities seemingly manifested only in his dreams. He was 12 when a hunter sent by the church slew his parents, and he found himself alone, eventually making his way into the city as an orphan, learning a trade, and raising a family who he would in time outlive. As decades and centuries passed, and he grew increasingly aged, he sought others of his mother's race, in the hopes that he might learn to rejuvenate himself as they did. But in nearly 100 years of searching, he found not one fairy left anywhere in Europe, nor even a half-breed like himself. It was at that point, in the height of his despair, that he chanced to learn of a certain play then being performed in London, a revival of one written half a century prior by an Englishman named Shakespeare, which spoke of the matters of fairies. Grandfather did not document the name of this play in his memoirs, but I am certain he refers to A Midsummer Night's Dream. Johann recalled being told stories of Oberon and Titania by his mother as a boy. Perhaps this bard's recounting of their affairs, Johann surmised, meant there were still fairies living in England. He embarked on a ship to London to begin his search, hiding well out of sight of the city folk. But as fate would have it, his arrival in May of the previous year coincided with the arrival of the plague, and he had fallen ill with it, retiring into the crypt to wait for death. Wouter explained, as the elder man drifted into sleep from exhaustion, that he had heard his grandfather calling to him in his head for several months, begging him to come to London and aid him somehow. He had some difficulty finding a vessel willing to make the passage, but had arrived earlier in the month. Following instructions, he heard his grandfather's voice speak to him silently, that lead him to the crypt. He surmised that while his grandfather's elvish ancestry was strong enough to prevent him dying of the plague, it did not prevent him being sick with it, nor was it strong enough to purge the ailment from his ancient form. Instead, He lay helpless in the darkened tomb, in a perpetual state of fever, falling in and out of consciousness, and during those periods of slumber, suffered intense nightmares, which in turn caused the abrupt disappearances of the sun and the rising of the dead. Wouter feared to seek help from the authorities, knowing full well that the Church considers the fair folk to be satanic mockeries of God's creation and inherently anathema to the perseverance of a godly people, and that they were both apt to wind up on the stake if discovered. Though the elvish blood was even more dilute in his veins than it was in his grandfather's, he said that with practice, he had found the strength to work the apparatus of the bakery and deliver the products thereof to the crypt, in the hopes that he could nurse him back to health and give him the strength to overcome the plague. Indeed, there were a great many half-eaten cakes and pungent bones of beef strewn about the chamber. At these revelations, the bishop and his deacons found themselves in deep discussion as to what to do next. Fairies lack a divine soul, and it is right and just to kill them upon discovery. But though these two were of elvish blood, they also had the blood of man, and thus the spark of the divine within them. Johann was clearly ill and insane, and would be better suited for Bedlam than for the gallows. But the nature of his condition meant that imprisoning him there would do no good. What of the younger one then? His intent was pure, if his deeds were unseemly. Perhaps it was best to confine them both in some isolated environ for a time, while the Archbishop could be considered. It was at that point in the conversation that Grandfather crossed himself, muttered a brief prayer for the old man's soul, drew a pistol from the brace over his shoulder, and discharged a silver bullet into the poor half-breed's heart. The sound of the report in the crypt was deafening, and the flash of light almost blinding, and Wouter issued an unholy scream, as in an instant the life faded from Johann's eyes. Grandfather tossed the spent pistol aside, and made ready to draw a second and end the life of the younger man. But before he could do so, the bishop placed himself between the two, and demanded that he stand down, for from the top of the stairs there shone a light that before was absent, the light of the noontime sun, which had vanished when the elder fell asleep moments before. The horror, it seemed, had ended. In the following days, the sun began to rise and set as it ought to during the waning days of summer, and the dead rose no more. A handful of Londoners continued to pass from their symptoms, but by the 1st of September, there were no new illnesses to document. There was some brief discussion among the city fathers as to what should be done with the earthly remains of poor Johann. Several doctors of the city expressed a great desire to dissect the corpse, as it was possible that examination of the brain might elucidate some of the differences between our races that enabled the fairies to perform such amazing feats, and that a body in such a heretofore unseen advanced state of plague might provide clues as to how to better treat the malady in the future. Ultimately, the bishopric decided against such desecration and ordered the body burned among the common victims of the plague. When Wouter had his day in court, it was the opinion of the Chief Justice that he could be found guilty of any number of offences warranting death, hard labour, or transportation, but in consideration of the circumstances, deigned to grant mercy to the youth, instead ordering him to pay 5 shillings to the baker for the misuse of and damage to his property. Wouter had scarcely a penny to his name, but Grandfather grudgingly paid the fee on his behalf, on the condition that he depart England by week's end and not return. It was in the wee hours of the following Sunday, of course, that infamous great fire arose in the west of London. 4 days it burned, and most of the city was reduced to ruin by the time it had passed. Had the fire struck the city a year or two prior, tens of thousands would have been caught up in the Holocaust. But after the deprivations of the plague year, many of the homes incinerated were no longer inhabited, and it is believed that only a handful of Londoners died in the blaze itself. In the weeks that followed, as the rubble was cleared and the prospect of rebuilding the city began to arise, the coroners of the city determined that the fire had begun on Pudding Lane, in the area of the same bakery where Wouter had been found working his magic to supply food for his grandfather. Of the bakery itself, nothing remained, but the great stone oven stood still, and within it there was found the skeletal remains of a man, scorched by temperatures unimaginable, yet not reduced to ash. In his papers, grandfather suspected the remains were those of Wouter, and that, despite the seeming honesty of his testimony, he was not what he seemed, for in Johann's own testimony, he mentioned a family, but never mentioned a grandson, let alone one as youthful as Wouter had appeared to be. Given his grandfather's ability to conjure life from non-life, it was possible, and indeed likely in his supposition, that Wouter had never existed until Johann conceived of him in a fever dream. A grandson he never had, who could aid him in his hour of need, who possessed the ancestral talents he himself lacked. With his creator dead, Wouter no longer had a purpose, and chose to take his own life by lighting the fire in the oven and laying himself within it. And as he felt his body burning, he unwittingly tapped into those same powers and ignited the city around him, turning all of London into a grand funeral pyre. London was, in time, rebuilt. From the fetid medieval shanty town it had been, into the gleaming metropolis we behold today. And since the fire, the plague has not returned to our city, nor has evidence of the continued existence of the fair folk reached the banks of the Thames. You may be inclined, dear readers, to think this account a bit of humbug. It will, after all, be nearly Christmas by the time this tale makes its way to the newsagents, and Christmas is the time of year for the telling of ghost stories. If you are so inclined to believe these words to be naught but fiction, then I shall not dissuade you, and I shall say Happy Christmas to you, and a Happy New Year as well. But if you are so inclined as to believe this account of the evidence I have unearthed, then I present for you a postscript. In his final years, grandfather would often invite me to his study and tell me great tales of the Blackwoods who had come before me, primarily of Richard Blackwood, his son and my father, but also of his own father and grandfather and their brothers and sisters. He showed me once a family tree he had composed after countless hours of research that cited baptismal records and tax records and censuses dating back to the Domesday Book. As I was compiling this account, I thought I espied a detail that I vaguely remembered from that family tree, and after some careful searching through the library in our family estate where his collection is housed, I found the document. 5 generations before my grandfather, there is listed Henri du Blackwood, 1st Viscount of Westminster, and the first of my lineage to be awarded the title Lord Blackwood. He is listed as the child of Etienne du Blackwood and Genevieve van der Horne, whose father, who according to baptismal records was born in the year 1149, was named Johann. Happy Christmas. Happy New Year. Sleep well, and if you must speak of the fair folk, do so flatteringly. Lord Blackwood and the Great Tarasque Hunt of '83. May 14th, 1883. I received a most curious missive in the post this morning. It has been 4 months since I returned to England, having nearly lost my life in endeavoring to become the first man to reach the summit of the foreboding and deadly Mount Everest. I have spent the time since in research and recovery here in London, nursing my wounds and documenting my memoirs of the harrowing trip up the mountain and my nearly fatal encounter with the creature I found there, a tale which I fear may never be told outside these diaries, and I have not planned to embark again for distant shores until after summer has passed. That has changed, I fear, as the result of today's letter. It was a formal affair, written in a folded card like a wedding invitation, sealed in the finest envelope, and I present it to you below. To Lord Theodore Thomas Blackwood, Commander of the Most Excellent Order of the British Empire, Colonel Joseph d'Enfant, L'Armée de Terre of the Republic of France, does hereby cordially invite you to participate in a hunt of a great and terrible creature that threatens the lives of thousands. The Tarasque, a creature great and terrifying, of late believed to be legend, has arisen and threatens the security of the land of Provence and of France itself. Colonel d'Enfant has been authorized by the President of the Republic to pay a sum of 5 million English pounds to the man or men who shall slay this infamous beast. RSVP, in care of Colonel d'Enfant, number 22, Kensington Road, Knightsbridge, London. I immediately dashed off an acceptance and sent it out with the afternoon post. Though I have hunted foxes and elephants and every beast, great and small, in between, I had never heard of such a creature as the Tarasque, and certainly never had an opportunity to hunt one. I spent my afternoon in the study, poring over encyclopedia and tomes of history and mythology, before I found the term in a collection of folk tales regarding Saint Martha, sister to Mary Magdalene, who had supposedly calmed the beast with her song. The text described it as a vicious creature, a massive chimera that breathed fire and whose scaly hide repelled every blade, that killed without remorse and seemed only to wreak chaos for its own enjoyment. When the last delivery of the day came just before tea time, I had received an address and directions to attend a briefing the day after tomorrow in the city. I have always been a firm believer in the proposition that even in the most preposterous of myths, there lies a kernel of truth. Whether an ancient behemoth that breathed fire was bringing ruination to the south of France, I knew not. But I knew that the army and the president themselves were concerned enough to seek out a man such as myself, and were willing to offer a bounty that would finance a score of proper expeditions for the killing of a single beast. On Wednesday, I will learn why. May 16th, 1883. Today I attended Colonel d'Enfant's meeting, held in a private room in the city, at the club owned by Messrs. Marshall, Carter and Dark. Lest the reader question my morality, I assure you that I am no member, dues-paying or otherwise, of that association. I find their stock in trade offensive and deplorable, and their clientele even more so. But on this day, the windowless establishment was free of its usual throng of libertines and bohemians, replaced by a handful of officers and men in the uniforms of the French, a handful of our own soldiers guarding the door. Servants and waiters, apparently relieved to be in our company rather than that of their usual employers, offered drinks and hors d'oeuvres to their guests. Besides myself, there were 3 guests of honor at the meeting. There was an American, Mr. Roosevelt, a young man who had made for himself already quite a name as a hunter of big game in the American West. There was Mr. Dukov, a Russian I knew of by reputation as a scientist and historian. Lastly, there was another Englishman, the same Mr. Harris, whom readers of these pages may recall as he whom I matched wits with on the banks of the Nile in 1855. I will spare the reader the excruciating details of our past intercourse. Suffice it to say that Mr. Harris and I were schoolmates at Eton, that I regarded him then as little more than a common blackguard, and that what news I have heard of him since then has given me little reason to change my assessment of his personage. Colonel d'Enfante, a short and middle-aged man who bore signs of great fatigue and worry, spoke briefly and elaborated on his reasons for calling on the four of us. The being that his government had come to call the Tarasque, he said, had first appeared the Sunday after Easter near the village of Tarasque, named, most coincidentally, for the mythical beast itself, and had destroyed the town utterly, claiming several thousand souls in the process. The handful of survivors who escaped the devastation had described a great lizard, nimble and merciless, that had charged directly into the town square and destroyed everyone and everything in its path, crushing, smashing, and devouring people, livestock, and buildings alike. One man, a farmer whose wife and children had been ripped to shreds by the beast, claimed that it spoke to him, in plain French, and told him of them. Ils étaient répugnants. Since then, the colonel said, 3 outlying villages and countless farms in Provence had fallen to the Tarasque. It attacked without mercy or reason, killed indiscriminately, and left only devastation in its wake. The army had sent men and horses and cavalry against it. There were few survivors, and those who lived claimed the beast had been struck directly by artillery, and neither flagged nor missed a step, the hole in its chest seemingly knitting together as it charged their position. The entire region had been quarantined. Citizens were being evacuated by the thousands, and the army and the press were passing stories of plagues and Prussian revanchists. But his government feared the worst would soon come to pass. Nimes, Avignon, and Arles were in danger if the beast continued to rage. The 4 of us, the colonel claimed, were the finest hunters and scientific minds available and known to his government. He knew not if we were capable of taking down such a monster, but between our expert knowledge and unique access to the finest tools and weapons known to science, he hoped we could succeed where his own forces had failed. I left the meeting with a stack of papers, details of the army's knowledge of the Tarasque based on what reconnaissance they have to date endeavored. On Saturday, the 4 of us will board a steamer across the channel and travel to the epicenter of this pandemonium ourselves. Deeds, my loyal valet, has begun packing my bags and is having the more exotic armaments in my arsenal prepared for shipping. I do not anticipate working with Mr. Harris any more than I anticipate shaking hands with the devil, but Messrs. Roosevelt and Dukov appear to be of sound mind and fine spirit, and with luck, our motley quartet shall return to England with a fortune in our pockets and a story to tell. May 20th, 1883. We disembarked in Avignon after an uneventful trip by train from Calais. It may seem strange for a globetrotter such as myself, but until this weekend I have never had occasion to travel to France. After all, it is a civilized place, lacking in the ancient mysteries and elusive game that is my passion, or so I would have thought. Mr. Roosevelt and I spent many hours sharing our tales of adventure. I find in him a true intellectual who understands what it means to be a naturalist. Mr. Dukov, I found more difficult to talk to. He is a private man who prefers the company of his books and his studies to that of his fellows. He proudly displayed a variety of his own inventions he intended to test against the Tarasque. A gun that fires beams of electricity, a jellied kerosene that burns without exploding, and what he described as his latest prototype, a large rifle on a tripod, fueled by refined pitchblende, which I suspect is not entirely different than Mr. Moth's destabilizing muskets, one of which I had brought myself. I did my best to avoid speaking to Mr. Harris during the trip. I intend during our expedition to be no less than a gentleman, but the man leaves a sour taste in my mouth. When we boarded the train at Calais, I watched as he had a large crate loaded onto the train, which he told us contained his secret weapon. He refused to tell us what the box contained, but viewing it made me uncomfortable. The air seemed to chill as it was carried by. In any event, it is too large to fit in our wagon. For now, we shall be leaving it in a bank vault in Avignon. Our weapons and provisions have been loaded onto a wagon, and horses have been readied for us. Tomorrow, Colonel D'Enfante will escort us to the edge of the quarantine zone. From there, he says, the four of us shall be on our own. He can spare no more soldiers, lest the beast attack the fortifications directly and break loose. May 21st, 1883. I have seen the horrors of war often enough in my years. I saw the wrath of the British Empire firsthand when I lead troops in the Opium Wars. In Africa, I have seen native tribes fight to the last man, destroying everything in their path. In the Crimea, I barely escaped with my life, as thousands of men fought and died, and cities were laid bare. The destruction I saw there pales in comparison to what I have beheld in the Tarasque's wake. Avignon itself looked like a city at war, soldiers patrolling the streets, barricades at the edge of town. Not far outside the city, we reached the edge of the quarantine zone. Soldiers had been hard at work, digging trenches, erecting fortifications. The young men keeping watch looked battle-scarred, as though they had seen indescribable horror. A constant stream of evacuees made their way out of the area. Women and children, some with little more than the clothes on their back. Many looked confused and agitated, as if they had no clue why they were being removed from their homes. On the faces of others there was no doubt. I asked on passing if any of them had yet seen the Tarasque. Only a few, the scouts and lookouts, had seen it from a distance, I was told, for nobody who had engaged the beast at close range was still alive. It had not yet dared to attack the perimeter the army had erected. But 2 days prior, a watchman told me, he had spotted it a mile from the front line, seemingly staring back at him. Mr. Harris grudgingly agreed to ride out alone and scout for the beast, while Mr. Roosevelt, Mr. Dukoff and I followed the road to Tarasque to learn what we could of the nature of our quarry. Tarasque itself was a scene of utter ruination. Bodies lay by the score in the streets where they had fallen. Much of the town had been consumed by fire. The town's famous castle and other stone buildings dashed to rubble, and massive holes torn in the walls that remained standing. We saw not a living soul, no man or woman, no livestock, nor vermin, nor birds or beasts of the field. Even the greenery of the town seemed to have been destroyed. I began to feel pangs of doubt in my stomach as we surveyed the scene. Could one creature have truly wreaked such destruction? We set up camp on the edge of the dead town. Mr. Harris returned by evening and informed us he had spotted the Tarasque to the southwest, near the village of Bellegarde, in the act of destroying a farmhouse. Its route, he said, had not been difficult to trace, for a swath of barren land seemed to lay a trail. Even the grass itself was not safe from the Tarasque's wrath. Tomorrow, we will follow the trail and engage the beast. May 22nd, 1883. We have met the Tarasque this day, and we are lucky to have escaped with our lives. We traveled southwest to Belleville, which we found in a state of destruction, not unlike that of Tarasque itself. From there, we followed the creature's trail as it meandered south, then west, then northwest through the farmlands, drawing uncomfortably close to Nimes. Shortly after midday, we spotted the creature in the distance. It was stationary, seeming to nap in the afternoon sun. It was a massive thing, longer than a whale and taller than a giraffe, and it looked to outweigh either. Its scales glistened in the sun, and its teeth, massive and shining, were bared as it rested among the chaos it had wrought. Had it wings, I would have called it a dragon. With our weapons in tow, we stealthily approached the beast to a range of less than 100 feet. Mr. Dukov set up his pitch-blende gun, which he claimed would take some time to charge before it could be fired, while Mr. Roosevelt and Mr. Harris prepared their elephant guns, and I readied my particle destabilizer. Behind a short fence demarcating one of the now abandoned farms, we drew straws, and it was agreed I would take the first shot at the abomination. Steadying my gun against the fence, I took careful aim for the sleeping Tarasque's head. I held my breath, made my final adjustment, and fired. The shot hit square and true, and we watched with delight as the top of the Tarasque's head was shorn clean off. The beast slumped to the ground, and I breathed a sigh of relief. In one shot, the beast that had killed thousands and menaced a nation was dead. Mr. Harris let out a cheer, and the dead beast came to life. It rose to its feet and turned in our direction. Blood, brains, and gore oozed from its skull as a head missing an eye stared us down and let out a blood-curdling roar before it charged at us faster than a bull elephant. Mr. Roosevelt and Mr. Harris barely had time to fire a round each at the beast before we were forced to scatter. Harris tossed aside his elephant gun for a smaller repeater he had been carrying and discharged a magazine into the Tarasque's flank. And we watched in horror as the wounds it took sealed themselves within seconds. Mr. Dukov was forced to shut down his pitch-blende gun before it could fully charge, and fired his electric rifle 3 times into the monster's open wound, stunning it for long enough for us to reach our horses. By the time we were on horseback, the beast was up again and charging us, and flesh and bone was knitting anew over the open cavity in its skull. I fired the particle destabilizer again at its foreleg, and took it off entirely, hobbling it as it tried to chase us on 3 legs. We rode in 4 directions and agreed to meet behind the quarantine line. I saw the beast attempt to take off in pursuit of Mr. Roosevelt as the stump of its leg began to grow and take new form, but he was able to elude the Goliath, and by nightfall, we were among the soldiers at the barricade, our prides injured, but otherwise in good health. May 28, 1883. Luck and providence have provided. Thus far, the Tarasque has made no effort to escape the quarantine area and has proven content to ravage the abandoned farms of Provence and feed liberally on the animals and plants left behind. After our second attempt to attack the Tarasque on the 23rd proved no more successful than the first, we have come to a conclusion that the beast cannot be killed simply by gunshot or electrification or setting it aflame, for the rate at which it heals its injuries is so great and its tolerance for pain and mutilation so high that even the mighty broadsides of the Royal Navy would have little chance of destroying it before it could take their lives in trade. To slay the Tarasque, we determined, we would have to immobilize it and deal such destruction upon it that it would be utterly annihilated before it could free itself. We discussed for several hours how such a thing could be achieved, before an old sergeant, who had been manning the night watch, begged our ears. The sergeant had, he said, fought in Vietnam when the natives there attempted to rebel against the French in '68, and had seen them make use of a trap that was elegant, easily disguised, and deadly. Mr. Roosevelt and I talked over the fine points of the idea well into the night, and the next day, the four of us traveled into the field to lay our trap. We prepared our trap in the fields near Gravesend, a village between Tarasque and Avignon that the Tarasque had yet to lay waste to, and where the water table was amenable to our task. By careful observation, we had judged that the beast stood about 9 feet at the shoulder, 6 feet wide, and 30 feet long. With the help of a few soldiers, whom Colonel d'Enfante had grudgingly conceded to parting with, we dug a long trench in the field, wide and long enough to contain the beast, and deep enough to stop the beast climbing loose before the damage could be done. In the bottom of the pit, we mounted steel rods, sharpened to a fine point by the hundreds, each tipped with a noxious poison I had acquired in the Orient. Running lengthwise through the center of the pit, we built a wooden bridge, large and sturdy enough to accommodate a man on horseback, but not so sturdy that it would not break and shatter under the weight of the Tarasque. 4 days we were involved in the earthwork. The digging done, we laid a net across the top, and it was covered with grass and leaves. From a distance, it looked to all the world like an ordinary patch of open land, beneath which laid doom. Mr. Harris has spotted the Tarasque not 2 miles from our location, and tomorrow we will spring the trap. Mr. Roosevelt has agreed to act as bait. He will approach the Tarasque on horseback and attack it once with his elephant gun. And once it gives chase, he will lure it to the pit. He is to gallop across the bridge and lure the Tarasque to follow him. And when it attempts to do so, it will surely fall into the pit. Messrs. Dukov and Harris and I, lying in wait out of sight, will then join Mr. Roosevelt at the pit's edge and unleash the full fury of our armaments onto it, our rifles and shotguns, the particle destabilizer, Mr. Dukov's electric rifle, and provided it is charged safely, he shall make his first firing of the pitch-blende gun. Once our armament has been exhausted, we shall pour 4 barrels of Mr. Dukov's jellied kerosene into the pit and ignite it. And, Providence withstanding, nothing shall be left of the creature but ash and bone by sundown tomorrow. May 29th, 1883. Success. The plan went off without a hitch. It was afternoon before Mr. Roosevelt could coerce the Tarasque into pursuing him, but surely enough the reptilian behemoth fell into the pit, impaled upon the spikes, and was stuck while the 4 of us rained destruction from above. The monster let loose a screech from the pits of damnation itself, as bullets and explosives tore its flesh loose, bit by bit, and jellied kerosene burned slowly and stopped it regrowing. Mr. Dukov warned us to avert our eyes when he finally fired the pitch-blende gun, and his warning was justified. The blast was bright enough to blind, and a massive plume of smoke and fire erupted from the pit after he had pulled the trigger, seeming to blossom into a mushroom above us. By the time the fires had died down, a charred skeleton was all that remained. We have separated the beast's massive skull, blackened and perforated, from what remains of the monster, and a handful of soldiers who reported after the blast are hard at work filling in the pit with earth. Tomorrow, we shall bring the skull back to Avignon and collect our reward. May 30th, 1883. Disaster. We were hailed as heroes by the army when we arrived in Avignon with our prize. In the morning light, the Tarasque skull seemed whiter than it had the night before, and more charred flesh stuck to it than it had seemed when we dragged it from the pit, though surely it was little more than an illusion. The four of us posed for photographs, and Mr. Dukov asked to have his photograph taken with his head in between the massive jaws of our fallen prey. Imagine our horror when the jaws snapped shut, severing Dukov's head neatly at the shoulders. The skull of the Tarasque rolled loose from its place on the stage and snapped again, taking another chunk of his body, and the soldiers screamed and fainted as it seemed to be growing a new coating of flesh and scales over its charred exterior. We watched, shocked, as the honor guards fired a volley at the skull. The chips it took off seemed to replace themselves instantly, and I was dumbfounded as sinew and muscle seemed to spread across the creature's bones and knit into shape. The jaws of the disembodied Tarasque opened, and it shouted in French, "Vous me rendez malade." From the other end of the plaza, I heard more screams and looked to see the impossible, the rest of the Tarasque, covered in earth and grime, held together by a few lonely strands of muscle. The headless carcass lurched through the square with uncanny speed, trampling men in its path, ignoring gunshot and cannon fire as it made to rejoin its body. From the corner of my eye, I saw Mr. Harris take off running. Mr. Roosevelt noted he was headed in the direction of the bank vault and his secret weapon, as the skull of the Tarasque seemed to be making its way towards where I stood. I gave Harris chase. We found Mr. Harris, having dragged the crate out of the vault into the lobby, hurriedly prying the boards loose. Soon the crate fell away, revealing a stone coffin that looked truly ancient. It felt as if all the heat fled the room when the sarcophagus was exposed, and I forced back a shudder as I beheld it. 3 chains with massive locks held the lid in place, and the lid and casket itself were covered with hand-carved runes that looked to be Sumerian or Akkadian. I confess that I have not taken the time to learn the ancient languages of Mesopotamia, but I felt a distinct sense of wrongness emanating from the box as Mr. Harris drew a ring with 3 keys from his coat and began to unlock the seals, one by one. I begged with him to stop this madness and flee while we had a chance, and he insisted that once open, our victory would be secured. Mr. Harris pushed the lid aside and barely had a moment to regard his secret weapon in the flesh, before an olive-toned arm, sword in hand, lashed out from within the box and sliced his head clean off. In all my years of adventuring among the primitives and wild men of the world, I have never set eyes on a man who looked so savage, so elemental, so full of primal rage as the being that now climbed from the coffin, naked, sword in hand, its long black hair flowing behind it, its body covered head to toe in tattoos of eldritch imagery and ancient languages that resembled no script written by man. Sherman, the American general, is said to have told his enemies, begging for mercy, that they may as well appeal against the thunderstorm. What I beheld before me, I thought, was the very eidolon of the storm. Mr. Roosevelt attempted to entreat with the man and beg its assistance. Seeming to barely hear him, the God-man set his eyes on Roosevelt and lunged with his sword. Roosevelt parried with his rifle, the barrel cracking under its onslaught, and in surprise, the God-man dropped the blade. Roosevelt picked it up and attempted to return the blow, and in an instant, the God-man somehow held another sword in each hand. Mr. Roosevelt did his best to fend off his assailant's onslaught, but found himself cornered soon. Though I am loath to intervene in a fair fight between two honest men, I could not bear to see Mr. Roosevelt cut down in the midst of this pandemonium. I drew my pistol and emptied its cylinder, discharging 5 rounds into the God-man's head. Though it should have been dead, the olive-skinned destroyer turned and stared me down. Like the Tarasque, even with half its face gone, it seemed ready to kill. Dropping one of its blades, it moved its hand rapidly through the air and tossed something at me faster than I could react. In an instant, I could not move my arms. The man had somehow materialized a bola, a weapon used by the cowmen of South America to immobilize fleeing animals, and it had tied itself securely around my chest. Another flick, and a second bola struck me around the legs, and I was down on the ground. He approached to land the killing blow, when behind me, I saw the outer wall of the bank shudder and give way, and heard that offensive roar. The cry of the Tarasque, nary a scratch upon it, as it entered the building in search of its would-be slayers. The God-man caught sight of the Tarasque and lost interest entirely in Mr. Roosevelt and I. This, I thought, must be why poor Mr. Harris considered him his secret weapon. This avatar of rage lived to fight, and in the Tarasque, it had the ultimate rival. To describe the fight that ensued between those two unkillable titans would take 100 pages or more. Mr. Roosevelt and I huddled in the safety of the bank vault, which alone seemed immune to the destruction the two rained upon each other. After the better part of an hour had passed, hundreds lay dead around them. The center of Avignon, little more than rubble. The God-man was missing an arm and half a leg, an eye, and the better part of his brain, and his stomach had been cut open. In a state where most men would be long dead, it continued to fight, severing even its own entrails and making weapons of them. The Tarasque had suffered as badly. It was on the ground, recuperating, when I saw the God-man take notice of Mr. Dukov's pitch-blende gun, lying near what remained of the stage that an hour ago had been the site of such jubilation. As we watched, the God-man removed the core of the pitch-blende gun with an uncanny precision. He made what seemed to be bombs and explosives appear, and it strapped them to the device's core, which he mounted on his chest. Lighting a fuse, it charged at the Tarasque as it readied itself to meet him. Having seen the fury of the pitch-blende gun in a controlled state, Mr. Roosevelt and I had no desire to see what happened next. We retreated into the vault as a blinding light filled the square, and a blistering wind, mightier than the hurricanes of the Caribbean, slammed the door shut and sealed us within. It is dark. The light from my electric torch has provided just enough luminescence by which to write this account. I know not for how long the air in this vault will last. Aside from the lifeless body of Mr. Harris, there is nothing in this vault that approximates food or water. And as Christians and gentlemen, Mr. Roosevelt and myself have sworn not to pursue that dark path unless our lives themselves are on the line. I do not know if I will make it out of here alive. If I do not, let this diary be my last word and testament to the horrors that have befallen this corner of the world. June 13th, 1883. Providence smiled upon us after all, in the end. On the morning of the 1st, the vault door opened, and I regarded a major of the army and a company of men searching for survivors. Mr. Roosevelt and I were dehydrated and beginning to suffer from pitch-blende fever. Fortunately, I knew the address of one of my dear friend Henry's associates in Marseille, and upon being transported to hospital, he met us there and provided the treatments necessary to stave off the certain death that malicious ague carries with it. Colonel d'Enfante is dead, I have learned, and at least 10,000 others who were incinerated when Avignon was consumed by flame. Even those who had survived, I learned, have been burned or blinded, and pitchblende fever will likely claim many of them in time. No sign has been seen of the Tarasque or the God-Man since the explosion, nor, for that matter, of the icy sarcophagus in which he had apparently slept until the late Mr. Harris loosed him upon the city. It will take years, if not decades, to restore this ancient region to its former glory. We were two of only a handful of witnesses to one of the greatest disasters to strike France in recent memory. And having been at the center of it all, the army regarded us with great suspicion. We were interrogated several times, first by soldiers, then by police, then by politicians. A man who looked English watched and took notes, but said not a word as we told our story. In the end, we escaped transportation to Devil's Island, but the reward that had been promised was forfeit, and we were sternly warned that neither of us were welcome in France again, so long as we lived. The explosion that claimed Avignon was seen for hundreds of miles, I learned, and the press from Paris to New York were heavily embroiled in speculation. Everything from a falling star, to a German superweapon, to the wrath of God himself, was being proposed as an explanation. We were warned not to share our personal knowledge of the event with others, as we were sent on our way. Mr. Roosevelt and I parted ways in Calais. He intends to return to America, he informed me, and pursue a political career. In that I wish him well. I returned to my house in London this afternoon, and was informed by Deeds that a postcard had arrived for me this morning. The handwriting in the brief unsigned note within resembled that of the strange Englishman who had attended the questionings, whose notes I caught brief glimpses of from time to time. I present that message below. To Lord Theodore Thomas Blackwood, Commander of the Most Excellent Order of the British Empire, the Royal Foundation for the Security, Containment, and Protection of Anomalous Objects and Phantasmagoria requests a meeting for the purpose of negotiating an alliance favorable to both our parties. Please call any time, excepting Sundays, at number 19, Marylebone Road, Westminster, and ask to speak to Dr. Thursday. Your discretion is requested in this matter. I have not heard of this foundation before, and I do not know if I intend to take them up on their mysterious overture. Perhaps I shall hear them out, but I have never been one to serve in one man's employ for very long, and I value my freedom as a naturalist and explorer above all else. We shall see. Lord Blackwood in the Land of the Unclean, by Smapty. December 25th, 1875. As far and as wide as I have travelled in my years, there is nothing in the world quite like Christmas time in London. The crisp winter air echoes with the song of carolers, and everywhere one looks the eyes of his fellow men are filled with an air of peace and charity. I gave the help the day off after our early meal, and have spent the evening in quiet reflection and planning. For this Christmas, the germ of a grand and glorious new expedition has presented itself to me. 2 nights ago, I attended a Christmas party at the Gentlemen's Club. The food was fine, and the drinks flowed freely, and I remained in conversation with several of my fellow naturalists until well into the morning. Shortly after midnight, our discussion turned to the topic of the supernatural, and Mr. Wallace, the famed father of evolutionary theory and a noted spiritualist, told me of a most unusual occurrence he had heard of recently. An associate of his had recently returned from the Levant with a most unusual artifact, a small red disc, fashioned perhaps of cinnabar, carved with runes he thought to be an early form of Phoenician, or perhaps Cretan. When left to its own devices, the object would roll about on its own and reach great speeds, breaking through walls and crushing anything in its path, until it came to rest upon a mirrored surface. A man could pick it up easily no matter how fast it moved, he claimed, and until it was set down, it would glow brightly in strange colors. We found this account most curious, but what Mr. Wallace told us next proved even more interesting. 2 months ago, he said, his associate's maid had been cleaning in the room where the disc laid pressed against one of his dressing mirrors. Ignorant of the object's nature, the maid lifted it up to dust underneath it and set it back upon the mirror, whereupon the maid had said, the mirror's surface rippled and a man in strange clothes fell through, as if he had been leaning upon a wall that gave way. The man panicked and began flailing about and shouting nonsensically, and tried to flee before the maid locked him in the room and summoned the police, who took the man away as he shouted and tried to run back in the direction of the room he had apparated in. Mr. Wallace's associate had thought him at first a common thief, but there was absolutely no way the man could have entered the estate without arousing suspicion, and the maid's account was most clear. He had come through the mirror. I have long wondered if there were other worlds in creation where man, or beings like man, have existed and thrived. But owing to the great vastness of space, I have long assumed that none of them would be within our reach for some time. If Mr. Wallace's account was true, there might be a way to travel to one of those worlds right here in London. I entreated with Mr. Wallace for some time to divulge the name of his confederate. He refused, out of respect for his friend's privacy, but told me that the strange intruder, who claimed the name Ezekiah Belson, had been declared mad by the court and sentenced to Bedlam, and that I might find him there if I wished to. After New Year's, I intend to call upon this madman. January 3rd, 1876. The fact that an institution like Bedlam is allowed to exist in our great nation is an affront. Were a man not already mad upon entering these walls, the circumstances of his internment would make him so. I did my best to avert my eyes from the lunatics packed into dingy cells and overcrowded wards, as a porter led me to a padded cell where the man called Ezekiah Belson had been locked away alone. None of the doctors had been able to speak to him, she said. If I wished to try, I was more than welcome to do so. A gruff-looking jailer with a large and ancient-looking keyring unlocked the door, and I invited myself inside, where Mr. Belson sat alone in the corner. I introduced myself and said I had come to learn what I could of who he was and where he came from. He did not respond at first and turned his head away, mumbling under his breath. I listened carefully and found that the tongue he spoke almost resembled the English language, but it was far from any tongue that has ever been spoken in the Queen's court. Twisted and altered, as if by centuries of deviation, not dissimilar from how the many and various Romance languages evolved amidst the collapse of the Roman Empire. I stood and listened attentively as he repeated a series of sentences 3 times that I present below. Hey who are bitwain space pressed is your voce. Ye are watching and are your vissel, here and there. Away with me sin, Varda, and shed for me your sangry weapon, and I'll but do the word of the Vardas below ye. Speed. The man's accent was strange, and it was part way through his third recitation when it occurred to me that he was attempting to pray. I knew the prayer well, and when he finished his third recitation, I repeated it back to him in the Queen's English. He fell silent as he heard my rendition. His first reaction was more vitriolic than I expected. I believe he accused me of having the speech of the old elders, and accused me of being a sinner or a witch. I assured him as best I could that I was neither. I am a naturalist. He seemed to calm himself somewhat when he heard that word. In any event, he no longer feared me, and over the course of an hour or two, we worked out a pidgin of English and his dialect in which we could converse. In time, I came to the conclusion that he hails from a world which is surprisingly like, and yet completely alien, to our own. Mr. Belson claimed to have come from a place called the city where Elijah fell. He describes it as a metropolis that would put London to shame. Tens of millions of souls call it home, living in towers thousands of feet high, commuting on great trains and horseless carriages that moved hundreds of miles per hour through the packed streets. Every building was wired with electricity and possessed devices for receiving of sights and sounds from the other end of the world, for delivering the contained knowledge of entire libraries and other incredible wonders. I showed him a map of the world and asked where this city lay, and he pointed to America, on the western coast of the Floridian Peninsula. He claimed he had been at work in one of the city's great towers, momentarily leaning against a wall during a prayer break, when the wall seemed to fall away behind him, and he found himself in a strange old house with a strangely dressed woman screaming at him, confirming Mr. Wallace's account. I showed him a Bible I procured from one of the doctors and asked if he was a Christian. He recoiled at the proposition, as he had when I recited the Lord's Prayer, and informed me that, while the elders had been Christians in days gone by, all of that had changed with the Second Coming and the authoring of the Third Testament, and that to openly proclaim to be a Christian was a heresy and a most heinous crime. I gather that, in the nation Mr. Belson hails from, which he claims to control the entire world, the Church and the State have been brought together in a way that would make the Archbishop of Canterbury himself a proponent of disestablishmentarianism. I asked what becomes of heretics when they are caught, and he informed me that they are made pure in steers. For if heresy is allowed to spread unchecked, then the unclean shall come and bring destruction to the pure and the wicked alike. Mr. Belson refused to elaborate further when I asked him what the unclean were. He asserted that it was blasphemy to even speak of them, for to say their name might draw their attention. I assured him that nobody in London would harm him for speaking of this matter, and that, whatever an unclean might be, there were none in any corner of this world that I have explored. Belson was visibly frightened as he told me, in halting whispers, that the unclean were the devil. But unlike the devil of the heretics, who lived in the pits below, these devils walked the earth. They were giant creatures, behemoths of pure sin, all of man's unrighteous thoughts and deeds, given flesh. They stalked the darkest corners of the world, and their sin tainted the earth itself, so that no crop could grow, and no man could live. And it took all the efforts of the holiest crusaders to keep them so imprisoned, lest they break free, and the world come to an end. Until such time as the doctor assured me I must leave for the night, I remained in Belson's cell, and learned as much as I could of this strange world he came from. Matters of language, culture, fashion, everything a man might need to know, to travel amongst its gleaming cities anonymously. I managed to cajole a young nurse at the clerk's desk into letting me review Belson's file, and I learned that the affray that led to his arrest occurred in Notting Hill at the residence of a Mr. Weathers. Tomorrow, I shall call upon him and state my intent to purchase this disc that turns mirrors into gateways to another world, for I intend to conduct a survey of this civilization to rival Suburton's forbidden journey into Mecca, and, if I can, find one of these diabolical monsters Mr. Belson speaks of, and make it my prey. January 9th, 1876. Mr. Weathers was quite relieved to be rid of the disc when I purchased it from him. It glowed an eerie purple as he handed it to me, and yet once in my own hand, its aura seemed to fade and become instead a greenish hue. I took it home and placed it on a mirror in my study, and immediately the glass seemed to become as water. I saw a pastoral scene, not unlike that which one might behold in our own countryside. A farmhouse in the distance, tilled fields with tall crops between. There were children running and playing among the crops, and in the distance, over the horizon, I saw in silhouette titanic structures, taller than any building man on this earth has ever made. For several days I observed through the mirror. On a few occasions the farmer and his hands came close enough that I could hear their speech. The accent not as thick as Mr. Belson's had been, but foreign enough that I strained to decipher their conversations. The clothes they wore were not unlike those a farmhand might wear in England. But Mr. Belson had warned me the fashions in the city were very different from what he had seen in London, and I would be most out of place in any of my usual clothes. A visit to the Metropolitan Police, and after a lengthy conversation with the precinct constable, and the promise of a sizable donation, I was able to acquire the clothes Mr. Belson had been wearing at the time he entered our world. It was not dissimilar to morning dress, but to my eye, it seemed less formal. There was no waistcoat. The jacket was shorter and cut more conservatively with broad lapels. The cravat was thin and a solid shade of black. I had Deeds tailor it to fit me, and I stowed it away for when I reached the city. I have packed lightly, for I shall be traveling alone, and I shall have none of the native currency, for Mr. Belson had carried no billfold when he entered our world. I have my clothes and rations for a few days, and I shall enter dressed in a farmer's garb, and remain so dressed until I reach the metropolis. Gold and silver I have brought in the hopes of trading for currency, Mr. Belson having informed me that the principal form of trade is paper. And within my pack I have hidden my pistol and several of Mr. Moth's weapons. I have my compass, my sextant, my electric torch, a comprehensive atlas of the world, and my journal, and a few good luck talismans besides those. The cycle of day and night in this other world is some 8 hours behind our own. From this, I deduce that the scene I behold is somewhere along the western coast of America. I shall cross through the looking-glass under cover of night this evening for fear of alarming the farmers of my presence, and make my way towards the city, where hopefully I can discover a library or an institute of learning and document the history and culture of this world, and where the so-called unfertile zones are located, so that I might observe these unclean for myself. January 10th, 1876. What a world this is indeed. This is indeed one of the more temperate parts of the world, for though it was past midnight local time when I entered this world, the air was perfectly warm. Based on my reading of the stars, I judge myself to be somewhere near the 34th parallel, in the region that must in this world correspond to the land of California. Here in the fields, it is dark, but in the southeast, I behold a stunning panorama of light shining into the darkness, the aura of the great metropolis, bathed in electric light so bright that it shrouds the stars themselves above it. In the distance, I heard sounds like great engines. The terrain was easily passed, even in the darkness, save for a fence at the edge of the farm I had alighted into, which I was forced to climb. The sight I beheld when I reached the source of the noise was unbelievable. A great paved road lay stretched across the grassland, solid barriers at either side. It was wider than any road I have ever beheld, and stripes painted on the road indicated 16 lanes for traffic, 8 going in one direction and 8 in the other. The entire road was lit by giant lamps brighter than the gas lamps of London or New York, and one could have read a newspaper comfortably by their light. Even at this late hour, I watched in surprise and wonder, and no small amount of terror, I must admit, as motor carriages far more advanced than Mr. Bolle's steam cars hurtled along the road at speeds faster than the finest locomotive or the fastest racehorse. They must have been traveling 100 miles per hour or more, some of them small enough to carry a handful of people, others massive like train cars and looking to haul cargo by the ton. Some never touched the roadway at all, seemingly gliding on a cushion of air. I had to sit by the roadside, obscured in shadow, for some time while I took this in. Many times in my life I have encountered savage tribes that never before have seen the wonders of civilization. At this moment, I felt the savage myself, beholding wonders he has no hope of contemplating. I dared not cross the road, and as it seemed like a straightaway enough path to the city, I walked for several hours along its shoulder. It was difficult to tell in the darkness, but it looked to be about 30 miles to the outskirts of the city, and I judged it would take well past midday to reach the inhabited areas. I feared that any of the carriages hurtling by might at any moment careen out of control, and catastrophe would ensue, and I wondered how any man could bear such speeds. The eastern sky was beginning to show the tint of dawn when one of the carriages slowed to a stop on the edge of the road. Next to me, a door opened, and a voice from within asked if I desired a ride into the city. I have never been one to rely on the charity of strangers, but I was curious to examine one of the carriages from the inside and accepted. It was scarcely a quarter hour before we were among the crystalline towers of the metropolis. I did my best to disguise my terror as the driver, who identified himself as Ben Okazam, inquired of my business. I told him my name was Theodore Swarsrod. That, Mr. Belson had told me, being how my name would be presented in his language. That I was a farmhand in the nearby countryside, and that I had never before been to the city, but that I intended to research my family's history at one of the major libraries therein. We struggled to understand each other, as I had yet to fully master the dialect, but his assumption that I merely had a country accent saved me any uncomfortable questions. I disembarked in the financial center of the city and offered to pay him for the ride with one of my gold slugs. He refused, saying it was far too much for a simple ride, and I offered him a silver slug instead, which he accepted, and offered me a considerable sum of paper currency in the balance, while commenting that he never imagined the country folk had such wealth at their disposal. This metropolis, which I now know to be called the City of Angelic Glory, is easily larger than any city in all the world. I imagine the entire population of England could dwell within and find themselves wanting for neighbors. There is a great bustle everywhere I go in the city. And yet, there is a desperation and fear that underlies it all. Nobody meets anyone's gaze, and every man seems constantly to fear and suspect every other. With the banknotes Mr. Okazem had given me, I breakfasted in a bustling cafe where I enjoyed a meal barely dissimilar from the full breakfast one can find at any reputable establishment in London. And I have found board in a grand hotel named the St. George. Imagine my surprise when I was told my room would be on the 78th floor. An electric lift that would make Mr. Otis green with envy whisked me to the impossible height in seconds. And I found myself staring out a window at the gargantuan city. Towers like the one in which I stood jutted out in all directions, many of them extending hundreds of feet, even above my own vantage point. Highways not unlike the one that took me to the city crisscrossed the metropolis and formed a ring around its perimeter, and I beheld a massive network of smaller roads and railways. The hotel concierge has given me directions to the civic library. Tomorrow, I shall seek it out. But for now, I must close the curtains on this impossible scene and rest, for I find myself overwhelmed and weary. January 11th, 1876. My findings at this city's great library have shed much light into the nature of the world I now find myself in. The library itself stood 12 levels high, not as tall as many of the other buildings in the city of angelic glory, but easily taller than any institution of learning in London. A librarian guided me to the 8th level, where I would find books of history and geography, and I spent the day immersed in study. Though the books are written in strange letters that do not resemble any I have ever seen, I have found somehow that I am able to understand them as if it were common English writing. A comparison of a world map to the one in my own atlas confirmed that I was in the land of California, in about the same area as a town that in our world is known as Los Angeles. Many great cities in this world stood in the same place as cities in our own, though none shared the same name. London was here called the City of Winston's Stand, and Edo, the City of David's Triumph. I saw no national boundaries on the map, though there were many names indicating different regions: the United Lands of the Sun, Hephasia, the Land Bountiful. The only divisions indicated were between the Blessed Lands, colored green, and the unfertile lands, colored red. There were unfertile lands spread across the globe, though I found the distribution most uneven. In North America, I saw but 7, and in Europe 4, while Africa had dozens, and almost the entirety of China was covered by them. I found that the Bible exists in this world, but it is a Bible very unlike our own. It is about 1,000 pages longer and is divided into 3 sections, named the First, Second, and Third Testaments. The First and Second Testaments are similar to the Old and New Testaments of our Bible, but have been extensively rewritten. All references to God, the Lord, or the Father have been replaced with a simple reference to Him, and there is a greater emphasis on sin, uncleanliness, and purification than I recall ever learning in school. The Third Testament appears to have been written in the 17th century, and as I had not the time or inclination to read it in full, I referred to a history book about what is referred to in this world as the Second Coming. Prior to the year 1621 or so, I found the history of this world had been much like our own, aside from certain linguistic and cultural details, and an indication that the widespread colonization of the Americas had begun several hundred years earlier. In that year, the being called him made itself known to the people of the world, and nations worldwide proclaimed it to be their God. He provided them with great advances in technology and medicine, which were the impetus of the advanced civilization I now beheld. But war broke out across the world over the question of which nations were most worthy of his love. When he beheld the devastation that his children had wrought, he wept, and where his tears fell, those who tasted of them were purified of sin and lost their inclination to fight. But those who refused to cease in strife, those who were consumed by sin and evil, their wickedness was magnified in his absence and took form until it became the unclean, the giant abominations that to this day lurk in the unfertile lands. All life that the unclean encounter is destroyed utterly. Men and women, animals, even plants, are all consumed by the creatures and vanish into thin air, leaving behind only the ichor of sin it discharges when it feeds. Agents of the Church, known as the Blessed Militia, guard these lands and do constant battle to keep the unclean imprisoned within. In time, the united lands of the Sun brought together the nations of the world under the rule of a theocracy, governed by a man called the Most Holy Father. There were 10 ranks of the clergy, from the Most Holy Father himself to the Blessed Fathers at the bottom, whose hierarchy comprised not only the church, but the courts, the legislature, and the executive powers of government. The judicial system was not unlike English law, though it incorporated elements similar to the canon law of the Roman Church, and the clergy were exempt from its direct judgment, for only the Most Holy himself could pass judgment on them. The death penalty was unknown. Those who had committed great crimes were bathed in a compound called the tears, supposedly refined from his own weepings, and if they survived the trial, the urge to sin was cleansed from their mind. As luck would have it, one of the few unfertile lands in this country is located in the deserts 100 miles east of this city. On the maps, I spotted a railway line that draws dangerously close to this border. Interestingly enough, I noticed that almost every city had a rail line leading directly into the unfertile lands as well. But those were marked as for militia use only, and I deemed them inaccessible. Tomorrow, I shall travel on the train that passes this border and find a way to depart as close to the edge as possible and determine whether I can smuggle myself into this forbidden land. I know not how much of the history I have read is true, and how much is hagiography concocted by the Church, but soon I shall find out. January 14th, 1876. I'm lucky to have escaped the events of the past few days with my life, but even now I may be doomed. My entry into the unfertile lands was uneventful. I was able to excuse myself stealthily from the train during a brief stop, and hiked but a few miles under the desert sun to the edge. The perimeter in this region was guarded only by a fence with prominent signage. Warning: unfertile lands, unclean within, Blessed Militia, only beyond this point, by order of the Regional High Father, City of St. Francis's Triumph. The Blessed Militia, I assumed, must have some means of tracking the unclean and preventing them from crossing the borders of this country. I, on the other hand, would have to rely on luck and providence. I could smell the unclean for hours before I spotted it. Nothing grows in this land, and there is no running water, nor so much as a buzzard in the sky, but the air hangs heavy with the undeniable stench of death, worse than the foulest Scottish abattoir or the banks of the putrid Ganges. I could have been sick, but I steeled myself and pressed onward in the direction from which the stench seemed to be its strongest. I assembled and readied the destabilizing musket I had carried in my pack. A special model Mr. Moth had prepared especially for this expedition, and bringing to bear considerably more potential for atomic disassembly than the standard models. I spotted it after climbing a ridge and almost turned around and retreated right away. I had expected a creature the size of a man, or not much larger. The abomination I beheld was easily 500 feet long and dozens of feet tall. It was almost the shape of a man, but it had no legs. 2 arms that seemed to grow and shrink as they moved dragged a massive trunk across the desert sands, while a head with no face seemed to loll and stare at nothing in particular. Its skin, the tone of a white man's, was smooth and hairless across its entire body, and it made no sound as it seemed to crawl about aimlessly, a brown ichor seeming to ooze from it before quickly evaporating. It was no wonder the people of this world thought these things to be devils made flesh. Even with my heavy destabilizer at the ready, I was obviously ill-equipped to hunt a creature of this size. I observed for several hours as it seemed to crawl aimlessly in the same general area, with no particular direction or agenda, taking notes and making sketches. It was late in the afternoon when I determined I would have to turn around. A train bound in the opposite direction would pass by shortly after nightfall, and I intended to board it and return to the city. But luck was not with me. As I stood from my hiding spot upon the ridge, the Unclean's head turned in my direction, and it stopped its incessant crawling about. Though it had no eyes or ears, it somehow knew I was there, and though it had no mouth, the abomination let out a blood-curdling moan that echoed for miles. One of the creature's giant arms stretched out in my direction, and it began to drag itself my way. I had no choice but to stand and fight. I raised my musket at the creature's featureless visage, took careful aim, and fired. The Unclean was wholly unaffected, as the bolt from my musket passed harmlessly through it and dissipated in the atmosphere. In seconds, it was before me, and I was sure I was about to die. The creature loomed above me, resting itself on its giant hands as the face bore down upon me. Before it could presumably devour me whole, I heard a massive report, and a giant shell struck the Unclean in the face and exploded. I was showered with foul-smelling brown ichor as the beast's face was torn open, and though the wound seemed to seal itself quickly, more and more shells struck it in the face, the trunk, the arms. It stumbled, and I ran to avoid it falling on me, as men in dark-colored uniforms, decorated with symbols like those I had found on the disc in London, pounded it with artillery. It lurched at them, and one of the soldiers was devoured whole by the creature, its clothes and weapons falling to the ground as the man vanished. Soon it could take no more as the barrage continued, and it turned around and fled back into the desert. I retreated in the direction from which I had come to find a convoy of armored motor carriages armed with heavy cannons. I attempted to run, but in seconds the soldiers surrounded me and apprehended me in the name of the blessed militia. I was told I was lucky to be alive after attempting such a foolish pursuit, and that I would be put to the question by the court of blessed voices. My situation was compounded when one of the soldiers searched my pack and found one of my good luck charms, a small gold cross that had been given to me by the Patriarch of Alexandria during my exploits there in 1855. The soldiers immediately declared me a heretic, and some were of the opinion I should be shot then and there, or taken back for the Unclean to devour. In either event, I was bound with steel cuffs and escorted to a prison cell where I now await trial. They do not know I still have this journal, though if I am convicted of heresy and put to the tears, it may not long matter. January 16th, 1876. I was brought before the Court of Blessed Voices yesterday. The scene I found myself in looked like a scene out of the Spanish Inquisition. 3 men in arcane robes beheld me from atop the judge's bench, while I stood in the dock, guarded by the blessed militia. The senior judge advised me I had been accused of heresy and trespassing in the unfertile lands, and that I faced the tears and demanded my plea. No lawyer had been provided of me, and I expected nothing resembling a fair trial if I contested the charges. Yet if I plead guilty, I would surely be put to the tears, and my mind torn apart by that mysterious concoction. Recalling that the laws of this land were similar to those of medieval England, and that no member of the priesthood might be tried by them, I took a gamble and insisted that I was a man of the cloth, and thereby was entitled to benefit of clergy, the ancient right of a holy man to avoid prosecution by proving his ability to read from the Bible. The judges were most skeptical of this proposition. Even in this nation, the benefit of clergy was an outdated right, for many more people could read in these days than simply the priesthood. A reference to their legal texts, however, found that the right had never been disestablished. I was told I could attempt to exercise that benefit if I wished, but that it would then be up to the Most Holy Father himself to judge my fate, and he would be less forgiving than this court. I hoped for nothing less than to play for time, and I agreed. It was decided that I would be expected to read 3 verses. One of the strange Bibles of this world was placed before me and opened to the Third Testament, and I was asked to read a passage called Edward 7:22. As before, the strange lettering of this world's language made itself clear to me, and I read, "Be free of sin, therefore, as he and his angels are free of sin. For wherever evil transpires in the hearts of men, the unclean walk among us." Next, the book was opened to the First Testament, and I was asked to read Psalm 23:4. It was most unlike the version I had learned in chapel many years ago, but I read it clear and true. "Though I walk in the land of the unclean, I will fear no evil, for you are always watching. Your voice and your sight protect me." I was surprised when the judge closed the book and proclaimed I would have to prove myself by reciting the 3rd verse from memory. I was challenged to recite Matthew 5:38-39 from the Second Testament. I knew well enough the verse in King James's Bible, but I had no way of knowing how it might have been presented in this world, or even enough of their strange theology to guess. I felt doom creep upon me and decided to do the best I could, and closed my eyes as I recited the verses I knew. "Ye have heard that it hath been said, an eye for an eye, and a tooth for a tooth. But I say unto you, that ye resist not evil. But whosoever shall smite thee on thy right cheek, turn to him the other also." The judges did not at first respond to this reading. They retreated to their bench and discussed amongst themselves for a few moments, and one departed briefly, returning with a truly ancient book, which they examined while conferring further. I wondered if reciting the verse in its original form might have only confirmed their accusation of me when my bonds were removed, and I was ordered to follow the chief judge to his chambers. Seated behind a magnificent desk of fine ebony, the chief judge informed me that I had correctly recited the verse in question as it had existed in the ancient Bible before the Second Coming. Those old texts were forbidden to the public. Even the heretic sects made do with modern versions, and the only known copies in existence were in possession of the Church Fathers themselves for their personal study. The book he had examined was the only ancient Bible in the entire city, and before today had not been removed from safekeeping for over 50 years, and yet I knew its verses by heart. Therefore, he said, it was obvious that I was at the very least a Holy Father, one of the third highest echelon of the clergy, who had travelled incognito to his land for some purpose. Though he had no power as a mere blessed voice to compel my obedience, he asked why I had come, and what I had been doing in the unfertile lands with a heretic's cross and a strange weapon that was useless against the unclean. An opportunity had been granted to me, and I chose to take advantage of it. I informed the blessed voice, a senior member of the Church's Scientific Research Division, conducting tests on the development of improved weapons for suppressing or even killing the unclean. I told him my destabilizing musket was the product of this project, and it had shown promise in tests against tissue samples, and I had been delegated to test it myself in the field. Unfortunately, it had not lived up to its promise, and further refinements would obviously be needed before it could live up to its full potential. The cross, I claimed, was merely a trophy I had taken from a heretic in the priesthood after I exposed his treason. To my surprise, the blessed voice did not question my account at all. So great the respect for and fear of authority is within this nation, I suspect, that the mere supposition that I was his superior was enough to put me beyond reproach. By the end of our meeting, he had offered me access to a laboratory in the Blessed Militia's base at the edge of the unfertile zone. I accepted his proposition, and today I found myself examining a facility which makes the laboratory in my own estate look like a child's plaything. It is fully appointed with every instrument a man of science could want for, and several that I do not yet even understand the purpose of. There are full stocks of chemicals, as well as tissue samples acquired from the unclean, samples of their Icarus discharge, and a variety of medical nutrients and fluids, including the mind-altering substance called the Lord's Tears. I have been given private quarters within the base, and the militiamen give me a wide berth. I have noticed they avert their eyes as I pass them in the halls, and all conversation ceases when I enter a room. They believe I hold power over their very lives. For now, at least, I shall make no effort to disabuse them of this notion. It shall take me some time, but perhaps with this equipment and the samples provided me, I can learn enough of the nature of the unclean to genuinely construct a weapon capable of causing true damage to them. If only Deeds were here. At least, I would have a capable lab assistant. February 27th, 1876. I have made a truly horrifying breakthrough in my research today. I do not even know if the most senior leaders of this world know the truth. Some of them must surely know, if a heretic from another world was able to figure it out so quickly. And they have gone to great lengths to hide it from the world, in their lie of a religion. The beings called unclean are not devils or beings of pure sin, but gross mutations of the human form itself. The key is the tears. I know not what the true origin of that compound is or from whence it comes, but it is more than a simple tool of mind control. When human flesh is exposed to a significant enough concentration, it changes. The bonds that hold the atoms together peel away, and it becomes mutable and elastic, folding around and absorbing all other life introduced to it. A single mutant becomes 2, and then 3, and 4, growing larger and larger, becoming less and less human in form, until it becomes unclean, I wondered how these creatures first came to be created. Did the Church Fathers make weapons of them, to unleash upon those renegade nations that refused to submit to their will? Perhaps they use them for that reason still. I had found numerous reports in the history books of cities and countrysides being attacked by Unclean, suddenly loosed from their unfertile lands, whenever sentiment in that land had turned against the Church. Even now they continued to throw millions of people into the tiers every year to better control them, some of them surely mutating as the result and becoming the basis of a new abomination. No wonder there were railways leading into the unfertile zones. It was necessary to dispose of the persons so changed. I wondered how many were sacrificed intentionally to make the Unclean more powerful and more menacing as weapons of terror. I wondered what might happen if news of this horror became known to the people. How many more heretics would the elders throw in the tiers? How many cities would they loose the Unclean upon to suppress the threat to their power? How many uprisings could they manage? How many mutants could take form before the Unclean became uncontrollable and society itself was brought to its knees? I shudder to think of it. But with this horror has come revelation. The Unclean are born of using the tiers to allow people to absorb others into themselves. What if a compound could be produced that weakened those bonds? I think I can develop a way to produce a variant of the tiers that will counter the effect the original has had on these poor souls. I owe it to the people of this world to try. March 20th, 1876. Today is a day I shall remember the rest of my life. After weeks of research, I have produced my weapon, a serum which I have with no small amount of pride named Blackwood's Tears. I have tested it on tissue samples of the Unclean and watched them dissolve before my very eyes. It took several days experimenting with one of the most sophisticated repeater rifles used by the militiamen of this world. But I have developed a custom rifle that fires syringes filled with Blackwood's Tears. Upon impact, the force should activate the plunging device and inject the serum directly into its target. I have produced several hundred rounds of serum and loaded them into magazines. If my calculations prove true, it should take only a few dozen to destroy one of the abominations. Yesterday, I spoke to a colonel of the militiamen who confirmed that the trains into the unfertile zones are used to carry people who the fathers have declared incurably sinful, though he did not know the true meaning of that infamous phrase. He said a highly purified vial of tears was contained on each train, which lured the Unclean to it. Thus, the incurable were disposed of, and the Unclean were kept from wandering too far. I arranged for the train to be sent out this morning, empty, but for myself, my weapon, and the purified tears. Before I left, I gave him a copy of my findings and made him promise to read it entirely, including my opinions on what might happen if this knowledge becomes widely known, and to make sure that Blackwood's Tears were being manufactured around the world before the day when that knowledge comes out. He nodded in silent agreement as the train pulled away. Shortly before noon, the train parked itself at a dead end in the middle of the desert. I readied my weapon and waited in a blind outside the train as the stench of the Unclean began to fill the air. As I watched the abomination approach, I sighted its face through the remarkably sophisticated scope on the weapon and loosed the first round. The Unclean screamed with a fury unimaginable. I almost dropped my gun and collapsed in agony, but as I watched through the scope, the creature lurched and seemed to grow a few feet smaller than it had been before. I fired another round, and a piece seemed to vanish from its head. But now it had sight of me, and it was coming in my direction. I loosed several more rounds before I was forced to run. Pieces of flesh seemed to be sloughing off the creature as it dragged itself in my direction, its screams piercing the air with a deafening madness. I ran blindly, turning occasionally to fire in its direction, changing magazines from time to time. Alas, I had been paying more attention to the creature behind me than the terrain in front of me, and I found myself boxed in. I turned to fire again, and to my horror, I discovered the gun had jammed. The Unclean was less than half the size it had been before. It dragged itself in my direction, slowed but still unrelenting as I furiously tried to clear the jam. It screamed as it raised itself up above me. Somehow, in its wounded state, the monster seemed more human than it had before. Across every inch of the giant's skin, I seemed to behold a different face, and each furious proclamation it made seemed to echo with hundreds of voices in fear and agony. I was still trying to clear the jam when it began to bear down on me, and I thought I was soon to join the souls that comprised that thing in their unceasing damnation. But when the titanic head was barely feet away from me, it stopped. The Unclean held itself motionless above me. It could have moved in for the kill at any time, but instead it waited as I cleared the jam, and seconds later, my weapon was ready to fire. I understood. The Unclean was an amalgamation of cursed souls in eternal pain and confusion, seeking a release that was forever denied to them. The thing before me wanted to die. I aimed my weapon, closed my eyes, and emptied the magazine into its faceless visage as it screamed a final time, and the scream was instantly cut short, echoing across the desert before dissipating entirely. When I opened my eyes, a scene of utter carnage lay before me. Of the Unclean itself, there was no sign, but instead, hundreds of men and women and children, naked as the day they were born, lay sprawled across the desert plains, dead or dying. I walked among them and saw young and old, gasping for air in their final moments, for none of them lasted more than a few moments before expiring. Among the crowd, I spotted a face I recognized, the soldier of the Blessed Militia, who had been killed, so I thought at the time, in the attack that saved my life. As I looked at the dying man, his eyes met mine, and he spoke 2 words. Thank you. I made my way back west in the direction I had intended to flee in January, and boarded the train back to the city of angelic glory. The faster I can put this scene and these unfertile lands behind me, the better it shall be for my sanity. March 23rd, 1876. I returned through the mirror to London before dawn in the morning of this world, arriving back in my study just after noon London time. I was most thankful to find the gateway still worked. I had not expected to be away as long as I have been, and feared it might have ceased functioning, or the disc removed from the mirror. I immediately removed it from the mirror myself and set it on the ground, whereupon it rolled back to the mirror and attached itself. But having not been placed there by a human being, the mirror was only a looking glass, and the portal to that world and the horrors that populated it was, for now, sealed. I do not think I shall journey to that world again. The Unclean were monstrous enough, but there is a certain irony in the fact that, as alien and terrifying as they were, the greatest evil to populate that land was man itself, for it was the leaders of men who must have created the Unclean to begin with, and who continued to allow their existence in order to perpetuate their reign of terror. The gun and the Blackwood's tears I have brought back with me shall likely prove of little use in this world, but I shall store them at my house in the country for now. For if the being that provided the tears to that earth ever visits our own, the compound may one day prove of great utility. I visited Mr. Belson again today at Bedlam. I told him of my journey to his land, but what I had learned there I kept to myself, and that I had the means to return him there if he so desired it. He declined. Having been gone so long, and having vanished so suddenly, he would surely be under great suspicion if he returned, and would likely be put to the tears, a fate that I now wished on no man. I have promised to vouch for him with the jailers and earn his release. I told him that when and if he becomes a free man, there shall be a position available for him in my household staff, if he desires one. Deeds was very fascinated by my tale of my adventures in that parallel earth, and suggested I publish it. But who could believe such a fanciful story of worlds accessible through a looking-glass and gigantic horrors? Perhaps I shall present it as fiction in one of the penny journals that have become so popular among the working class. For whether they regard it as true or not, I suppose it does make a most entertaining yarn. Lord Blackwood, Astro-naut. April 3rd, 1856. My succor has arrived. For over a year now, I have been in London, exercising my duties in the House of Lords to aid Mr. Palmerston's government in bringing about the conclusion of the war in the Crimea. Those who have read these pages are well aware, I am certain, that I do not relish government office. The endless meetings and floor sessions and meandering speeches by whips and crossbenchers and the Lord Spiritual could drive a man to madness and represent nothing less than utter tedium to a man as afflicted by wanderlust as I. Still, with privilege comes responsibility, and when country and party call, it is my duty to don my robe, cast my vote, and maintain the proud heritage of the House of Blackwood as defenders of the Church and the State. With the Russians acquiescing to the treaty that has been signed in Paris this past Sunday, the war has ended, and so has the necessity of my sitting in Parliament. No sooner had I returned to my London estate after the final meeting, when Deeds informed me a caller had visited in my absence. Dr. Hightower, the astronomer, has requested that I meet him 2 nights from now at Greenwich for a demonstration and the discussion of a most interesting proposition. I have not heard from Dr. Hightower since our trip to Mars in 1843. If the news he has in mind to share with me is as elucidating as it was in the days leading to that adventure, then this shall be a welcome change from the quiet desperation in which I have suffered this past year. April 6, 1856. It has been many years, dear reader, since I was a man young enough to stay awake all night and feel no worse for it the following day. Of course, the nature of the occupation requires that an astronomer keep odd hours, and so it was half before midnight last night when I met Dr. Hightower at the Royal Greenwich Observatory. Dr. Hightower was most excited to see me, for a man who is typically most dour and sedate, concerning himself with the abstractions of physical science. He was uncharacteristically exuberant. He spoke to me of great discoveries and unique opportunities as he ushered me upstairs to the observing chamber, where the facility's great telescope laid bare the heavens to man's prying eye. For several years, Dr. Hightower informed me, he had been busily engaged in making refinements to the telescope that allowed it to compensate for the interfering effects of our atmosphere, allowing him to observe the heavenly bodies in levels of detail never before imagined. The doctor seated me before the great device and bade me to look into the eyepiece of the telescope, which he had delicately adjusted to expose his great discovery. I beheld, amidst the blackness of space, a massive rock, one of the many asteroids that Mr. Piazzi and his associates had discovered between the orbits of Mars and Jupiter in recent years. But unlike the copperplate daguerreotypes that had been published in the Times, this was no barren rock adrift in the void. Save for a few tiny blotches, the entirety of the oblong body was coated in a sea of verdant greenery, the unmistakable color of the virgin jungle. I fancied I could even see the leaves of the canopy that enveloped the miniature world, and at its pole I espied what resembled a palm tree, truly gargantuan in size, towering above the foliage of the world. This was a most interesting discovery indeed. While the famous canals of Mars had proven to be mere illusions when I visited them, and its atmosphere I found most unpleasant to breathe, here was proof, plain to see, that God in his wisdom had not set living things on our celestial sphere alone, but that the galaxy itself had been seeded with the germ of life. Dr. Hightower had first discovered the asteroid, which he had named Victoria in honor of our dear Queen, 5 years ago, during the mania following Mr. Leverrier's discovery of the planet Neptune several years before. He had kept his discovery secret, he told me, for he had a plan to announce its existence in a manner as grandiose as no astronomer has ever done. For 4 years, at his estate in Wales, Dr. Hightower has employed a team of men constructing a rocket similar to the one proposed by Mr. de Bergerac 2 centuries ago, larger and sturdier than the one that carried us to Mars on our previous voyage. Last week, the final preparations had been made, and the rocket now stood, fueled and ready, to escape the bonds of gravity and carry to Victoria a scientific expedition that will rival Mr. Darwin's. The astronauts will for several months have time to catalogue and sample the flora and fauna of Victoria and, for the first time since the discovery of Australia, return bearing knowledge of a new world and cement the names of those explorers in the annals of history. For months, Dr. Hightower has been assembling a crew to conduct this expedition. He has pilots, cooks, archivists, writers, daguerreotypists, painters, men-at-arms and labourers, he told me, but he wants for one thing: a naturalist to manage the exploration and scientific observation of this foreign planet. And of all the men of learning he has known, he could think of no better individual than I to play this part. How could I refuse? Today, I have been busy taking stock of what I shall need. We set off for Victoria on the 21st, when our world shall draw the closest to Victoria that it shall be in the next 30 years. And if luck and providence provide, we shall return by Guy Fawkes night. It is rare that I have ventured so far from our land of hope and glory, but England shall have to endure in my absence for a time. April 23rd, 1856. No matter how many times I am among the stars, I shall never grow accustomed to the sensation of weightlessness. One must learn anew how to perform the simplest tasks in this environment, as if returning to infancy, how to move about, how to eat and drink, how to sleep, even how to engage the water closet, for absent the caress of gravity, the slightest unintended twitch can send one hurtling every which way, and the slightest loose drop of moisture, applied to our rocket's apparati, could spell disaster. This morning, our vessel conducted a circuit of the moon. Dr. Hightower explained to me that we shall use our closest neighbor's gravitational field to produce an effect not unlike a slingshot, granting acceleration that shall enable us to reach Victoria months before we might reach it otherwise. To achieve our target, we must travel twice as far through the blackness of space as the distance that stands between our Earth and the Sun itself. Thus far, Dr. Hightower assures me, all has gone in accordance with plan, and we should reach Victoria by the 1st of July. We took advantage of our approach to the moon to make as many observations as we could. We took several daguerreotypes from the onboard telescopes, and the artists have produced depictions of the dark side, which Dr. Hightower informs me are the first ever made by man. I am told that the surface of the moon is an inhospitable place, wanting entirely for air to breathe, that a vacuum suit would be necessary to stand upon its surface, and that it will likely be 100 years or more before such a deed is feasible. Still, I would very much like some day to attempt it. May 24th, 1856. Today is the Queen's birthday, and beside that, today marks the point where we are officially halfway to the world named for her. In her honor, we held a party in the rocket's cafeteria. There has been little time for frivolity on this voyage thus far. All 63 of us have our appointed tasks to conduct every day, for our rocket is one of the most complex and intricate devices that man has ever engaged, and we are surrounded on all sides by millions of miles of emptiness from which no salvation will come if we are remiss in our duties. Dr. Hightower toasted the Queen as we sipped the precious rations of champagne he had stowed for specifically this occasion, and I offered a toast to science and to the progress of our empire. I wonder, what would Her Majesty say on this occasion if she knew that Englishmen were praising her name 90 million miles away? I spent a good deal of time contemplating this as I stared out a porthole into the darkness, the stars holding steady in the distance as we hurtled through the cosmos at a greater velocity than man has ever imagined. One truly feels small in these expanses. How insignificant is a man, how great is the mind of God, that in 1,000 lifetimes one could not hope to cross from one end of the universe to another. June 30th, 1856. Today, we entered into Victoria's orbit. The artists and photographers have been busy at the portholes and telescopes, creating the first records of this unexplored Eden. I was barely able to manage a peek for a few moments before giving up my spot, and I found myself utterly rapt at the sights that laid before me. What Dr. Hightower had shown me in the telescope at Greenwich was no illusion. The surface of the asteroid, now scarcely a dozen miles beneath my feet, was indeed blanketed thick with foliage, and I even fancied briefly that I espied a bird fluttering amongst the canopy. Tomorrow, almost all of us shall board the landing craft and embark for the surface itself, the handful of pilots remaining aboard the rocket to maintain its orbit while we catalogue Victoria's wonders for the next 2 months. Dr. Hightower has selected a landing zone at the edge of one of the cratered regions, where there is a break in the foliage large enough to attempt a landing without fear of being obstructed by the flora. I feel as Mr. Columbus must have felt when he espied the tawny, native people of San Salvador through his spyglass. We are on the cusp of revelation of the sort that happens but once in a lifetime. For tomorrow, I, Theodore Thomas Blackwood, explorer and gentleman, shall set my foot upon the virgin soil of a new world. July 1st, 1856. Oh, glorious day. It was barely 5:30 London time when our landing craft separated from the main rocket and made its way towards the surface of Victoria. The pressure of re-entry was almost unbearable, and flames licked the windows of the craft as we descended. It was dark outside the craft when we finally impacted the edge of the crater. Victoria is of such small size, Dr. Hightower explained, and of such an irregular shape that it takes little more than 4 hours for it to complete a single rotation. Day and night are brief affairs. One can almost watch the sun From this vantage, a dim and distant orb, no larger than the moon, race across the purplish sky from when it rises in the north until it sinks in the south. Because Victoria is so minuscule in relation to the Earth, Dr. Hightower had warned us that we would weigh but a tiny fraction of what we do there. Perhaps it was simply because I have become so used to weightlessness in the past 2 months, but I feel no lighter here than I ever have. Shortly after we made landfall, Dr. Hightower addressed us with a matter most grave. "We know not," he said, "whether the environmental conditions of Victoria are conducive to human life. It is entirely possible that the air of this world is unbreathable, or that its flora exude compounds poisonous to man, or that vicious beasts stood ready to tear a man apart, or that the air itself was lousy with bacteria that would kill a man slowly from the inside. It would be necessary," he said, "for a single man to expose himself to Victoria before the rest of the expedition alighted, and by his fate demonstrate whether it was safe for man to even exist on this world. It was entirely possible that that man might die, and that his death might be most slow and uncomfortable. But such a sacrifice, if it had to be made, might save 56 other lives. No man would be forced to make this sacrifice," Dr. Hightower said. "He sought only a man who was willing to risk his life in the name of science." I immediately volunteered myself as a guinea pig. Dr. Hightower at first objected. I was too critical to the mission, he said, to risk my life so frivolously. I put forth the proposition that as a peer of the realm and a gentleman, I have an obligation to, as it were, lead from the fore, and that I would never dream of putting any man under my authority into a position of hazard that I was not myself willing to occupy. If Victoria was too toxic for man to explore her wonders, I argued, then there could be no further expedition to begin with. And therefore, if I died in ascertaining its safety, there was nothing lost. The men were in solid agreement with this logic, and Dr. Hightower acquiesced. Shortly before 11 in the morning London time, as the sun arose over the crater's edge, I stood alone, in my finest khakis, boots, and helmet, in the landing craft's airlock. The hatch opened, and I breathed my first breath of Victorian air. It was hot and thick, more severe even than the oppression of the Amazonian jungle, with a bitter scent not unlike cinnamon. I breathed deeply, and though it was a most laborious effort, I found it not as hostile as the choking air of Mars, nor as cruel and unyielding as the sparse atmosphere of the Himalayas. Though I stood bare and exposed on a world where man had never before dwelled, I lived. Cautiously, I made my way down the gantry and set my foot upon the earth, the treads in my boot impressing themselves in the virgin soil. How small a step for a man, how great a leap for the empire. The earth before me was barren and plain. Less than a mile distant I beheld the forest that blanketed Victoria. Like a brick wall, it seemed to stand impenetrable, jutting hundreds of feet above the surface. The purple sky was a sharp contrast to the greenery, a vision worthy of one of the great French impressionists. I lacked the words to truly describe the sight and the emotions that ran through me as I beheld that alien landscape, and I wondered if a poet ought to have descended in my stead. With as much solemnity as I could muster, I produced from my jacket a Union flag, mounted to a small pole, and reverentially mounted it in the earth. As the men watched eagerly from the windows of the crowded vessel, I fell to my knees in the Victorian soil and made an address, heard but by God, that I had written and revised in my mind for hours since. I, Theodore Thomas Blackwood, Commander of the Most Excellent Order of the British Empire, 7th Viscount of Winchester, do hereby claim in perpetuity this land, the planet Victoria, in the name of Her Majesty the Queen Victoria and of her British Empire, on this, the 1st day of July, in the year of our Lord, 1856, and do hereby pray to our Lord and Saviour that our expedition to this land shall be fruitful and pleasing unto him. God save the Queen. I remained alone on the surface of the planet for several hours, an entire Victorian sunrise and sunset occurring in the meanwhile, as I took samples of the soil and documented in my journal the conditions of that world. By the time the sun rose again at 3:30, and the rest of the crew could see that I was alive and well, they began to alight as well. We established our base camp at the edge of the forest, which seemed to terminate at a certain point, as if a line had been drawn in the sand, and no plant dared extend its roots further. Tomorrow, we shall begin our journey into the forest proper, and endeavor to learn what we can of this planet. July 3rd, 1856. I once thought, dear reader, that I had beheld all there was that a man could hope to see in creation. I have wandered the jungles of South America and blazed trails across the frontiers of the West. I have lived among the unknown cults of India and Bangladesh. I have trekked across the great outback, wandered the vast and empty forests of Siberia, and laid men and dogs across the vast plateaus of Antarctica. So I had thought until this day. Were I to make a comparison, I would say that the Victorian forest is most like that of the rainforests of Brazil. Beneath the massive trees, little of the already sparse sunlight reaches, and were it not for our electric torches, we would be altogether blind. The undergrowth is thick and impassable, and we have had to make liberal use of our machetes to cut a path into the forest. Dr. Hightower's thermometer attests that the temperature, day or night, is almost a constant 130 degrees Fahrenheit, hotter than all but the most desolate of the Arabian wastelands. The flora here must derive their nutrition from the heat of the air, for no terrestrial plant could hope to blossom in an environment this dim. Already, we have collected several hundred samples of organisms unlike none that have been seen on Earth. I imagine that Oxford itself will be set on its ear for decades in endeavoring to decrypt the nature of these organisms once we announce our findings. To our universal surprise and delight, we have discovered this day that there is not only foliage, but that animal life exists on Victoria as well. Four-winged creatures, not unlike insects, flit through the air, alighting from flower to flower in the vines that crisscross the jungle. From mounds on the earth teem thousands upon thousands of creatures that for all the world are dead, ringers for the common ants one may find anywhere on Earth. We collected many samples of the insect life. The ants, however, responded with great hostility when we attempted to examine them. Mr. Andrews, one of the junior biologists in the mission, was suddenly set upon by thousands of the creatures when he attempted to examine their nest, and found himself suffering a toxic condition as the result of their bite. As we have yet to encounter any megafauna, I am beginning to suspect that the ants are the dominant organism of this world. I have often felt a curious rhythm emanating from the earth whenever I approach their nests, and I suspect that some subterranean machinery may be to account. July 11th, 1856. Today, our expedition reached the base of the giant tree at Victoria's pole. It has been less than 10 miles from the landing site to the tree's base. The jungle, however, has proven so thick that cutting our way through the thick vines has proven a full-time occupation for many of the men. We have observed yet no larger animals than the dragonflies of this world. As thick as the various and entangled vines of the flora are, I doubt that any larger animals could even evolve here. We have named this great tree the Major Oak, in reference to that ancient tree in Sherwood where Robin Hood and his band of outlaws held court. It is indeed, as I first considered it from telescope, very similar to the rare palms that grow along the tropical coast, but unlike those plants, it is truly massive. It stands some 400 feet tall, and 7 of the men, with their arms outstretched, were barely able to encircle it. I have taken several core samples from the Major Oak and would have willingly climbed her myself to acquire a sample of her fronds, but I am not the young man that I once was, and it was decided that Mr. Edelman, a junior biologist late of Cambridge, would perform that obligation. I watched in stunned silence with the men as he shimmied up that massive trunk, which must have taken millennia to become what it is today, and saluted us with a single thumb cast skyward as he reached the top of the organism. As I sit here writing in my tent at the base of the Major Oak, I find it impossible to believe that we have made such incredible breakthroughs in so many days. What will they say, I wonder, when we return to Earth and the proof of our exploration is published, plain for the world to see, in every periodical from San Francisco to Peking? Perhaps I shall finally earn the knighthood that I long have coveted. But no temporal honor is greater than the knowledge that the progress of science and reason, and of the glory of the British Empire, has been advanced by my efforts. July 27th, 1856. A most terrible calamity has befallen us this day. 6:30 in the morning, at the second sunrise of the day, we heard a strange sound in the distance. A droning sound barely liminal at first, that slowly grew louder and more ominous. It seemed to come from the direction of the sunrise. Mr. Andrews held his binoculars to the horizon and espied a terrible doom. A swarm of insects, not unlike the common locust, voraciously devouring everything in its path, and moving with great speed toward our base camp. We have not yet seen this type of swarming behavior from the Victorian fauna, and in any event, we had little time to study it, for in 15 minutes, they descended upon us. We scrambled to move as much equipment into the landing craft as we could, for what we left behind, the creatures devoured or destroyed. Poor Mr. Jacobs did not make it to the airlock in time, and I watched in horror as hundreds of the insects enveloped him and stripped him to the bone in seconds. Minutes later, the swarm was gone, and we emerged to survey the destruction. We are fortunate to have lost little of our research. However, we have lost many of our tents and a good deal of food and fresh water. Worst of all, the engines of the landing craft themselves have been compromised. Mr. Darren, the pilot, says we cannot now take off to rejoin our rocket in orbit, and it shall have to be repaired if we are to have any hope of ever leaving this world. For now, my work continues as it has. Many of the men have been assigned to rebuild the engines. The rest of us shall continue to study and observe and pray for their success. Dr. Hightower says that the rocket must begin its return to Earth no later than the 1st of November, lest the distance between our worlds become so great that the trip would be years in the taking. The doctor is confident that the engines can be repaired and that we should be homeward bound by September. A more immediate concern, however, is that we now have but 2 weeks' worth of food left to us, and with the landing craft out of commission, there is no way to bring more from the rocket, or even alert them to our distress. The water that flows in creeks and rivulets upon this world, and dribbles from the trees like morning dew, has proven safe to drink, But if we are to endure on Victoria until summer's end, we shall have to determine which of the native organisms are safe to eat.
Note to the reader: at Mr. Blackwood's request, I have heavily revised and edited the following 2 entries in this journal, as Mr. Blackwood had at the time come under the unfortunate effects of consuming Victoria's native flora. He was not of sound mind when he wrote these pages. The following entries contained numerous errors in spelling and standardized sentence structure, rambling and incoherent tangents of an incomprehensible nature, and several vulgarities which Mr. Blackwood is not proud of. And partway through the second entry, he had abandoned the English language entirely and began to write in Chinese. I have translated and standardized the spelling throughout, and expunged those portions which Mr. Blackwood has asked me to omit. I have done my best to maintain his genteel and scholarly tone and to describe the state of mind he was in at the time. I hope the reader will not feel that I have taken any undue liberties. Deeds being of smokeless fire.
August the 16th, 1856. It is difficult to write at this time. Though the affliction I suffer is less severe than many of the men, I find my mind clouded and confused, and it is a Herculean effort to keep my thoughts clear enough to express. We spent several days in experimentation with the native foodstuffs. Several of the vines and fruits were poisonous, and 5 of the men died most uncomfortable deaths. We eventually discovered several of the larger vines bear sweet and savory vegetables that could be eaten and digested without discomfort, and were indeed not unpleasant in taste. We feasted liberally that night, though at Dr. Hightower's request, the men working on the engines were to abstain for fear of a long-term effect that might impair their critical work. His judgment may yet save us all. Several days after we began eating the native food, we began to turn green. It was a minor pallor at first, like that of a jaundiced man, but with time it grew more severe. Some of the men who have eaten the most are almost the same color as the trees themselves. The coloring itself seemed to bear no more malicious effects along with it, however. Dr. Hightower assured us it was safe to continue eating, but I voluntarily cut my rations at that time. I have been eating only sparingly the last 2 weeks, and have lost a considerable amount of weight. A few days after that, the men began going mad. At first they complained of having difficulty in cognition, as I now do myself, and claimed hallucinations. Later they began speaking in nonsense entirely. Several of them seemed to sit for hours and have conversations in utter gibberish. A few have taken to frolicking naked amongst the trees and rolling in the dirt, referring to the plants as their sisters, and attempting to court them as if they were eligible ladies. Dr. Hightower has been spending his time by the largest anthills. He claims the ants are heathens, and that he intends to convince them of the righteousness of Christianity. He sits for hours with his ear to the ground, the ants crawling around and over him, reading aloud from the New Testament. As I write, he is currently on the 17th chapter of Acts. Curiously enough, I had always understood Dr. Hightower to be of the Jewish faith. I pray the engineers have our vessel repaired soon, for I fear the men may be beyond saving if we remain here much longer. I had to shoot 2 of the men yesterday. They had come to the determination that our landing craft was a great metallic devil and had to be slain, and were attempting to chew their way through the wires of an instrument panel. We are almost out of terrestrial food. The engineers may have to begin eating Victorian foliage in a day or 2, and choose between madness or starvation. Either way, we are surely doomed. We came to Victoria to explore in peace. Instead, we may remain here to rest in peace. September 8th, 1856. Dr. Hightower's madness may have saved us after all. I awoke from a stupor this afternoon, having collapsed in a stream by our base camp only to find myself in the air, being carried by a blanket of ants. I looked up and saw that ants were swarming over what remained of our camp by the millions, streams of them coming from every which direction and making their way to our ship. I feared that they intended to finish the job the locusts had begun, but not one of the men made any sound of distress, and I found that I had not a single bite upon me. The ants were carrying men by the dozens and loading them into our lander and carrying other objects as well, great hunks of metal and tools the likes of which I have never beheld before. They crawled in and out of the damaged engines. By God, they were repairing them. In less than 2 hours, Mr. Gregory, the engineer, a man now emaciated and half-starved for want of food, reported that the engines had come alive and our escape was possible. Not all of the men were aboard, but we saw no sign of the others. Either they have perished or run off into the forest in utter madness. In any event, those of us of sound enough mind voted and decided we could not spare another day to search for them. We have been given an opportunity, and we must make use of it. I caught a final glimpse of the Union flag I had planted in the soil in July as we lifted off. The 26 of us that were left abandoning the mad planet Victoria for the last time. December 12th, 1856. The journey back home was a long and arduous one, but I have never felt so relieved to be back in London as I was when Deeds greeted me at the door with a nip of brandy and my favorite silk pajamas. With as few of us in possession of our faculties as there were at the outset, it was nearly impossible to operate the rocket safely. Many of us did not sleep for days. Fortunately, once liberated from the planet and its madness-inducing flora, the men began to recover their senses, and our flesh acquired once again a healthy shade. Most of the men remember little of the time they were under the influence of those horrid crops. Dr. Hightower, I fear, may not recover fully. He is lucid indeed, but he lacks the sharp mind and cleverness he once had, and shall be retiring to the country. When I spoke to him the day before last, we agreed for now that it is best not to publish our full findings on Victoria. Any attempt to colonize that land will surely end in disaster, and if the culture of the ants is as advanced and sophisticated as it seems, they could oppress and conquer our empire as easily as the rebellions in India and Zululand of late have been put down. I shall keep the samples and notes we acquired at my country estate for safekeeping. Perhaps in a few decades, when we better understand the chemistry of those organisms, another adventure might be advisable. Deeds was seeing to the cleaning and mending of the clothes I had brought on that ill-fated expedition today, when he informed me that several live ants had crawled out a pocket and escaped through a crack in the wall. It is entirely possible they were nothing more than ordinary insects, but I wonder, after so many of the Victorian ants crawled over and through our ship repairing our systems, how many stowaways might we have brought back with us?